members, please be seated.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading.
Members.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021, debate adjourned.
Any members wishing to join debate on Bill 56 in second reading? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to rise this evening to speak to Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021, and it's an important topic as we have discussions with municipalities across the province, and obviously in my considerations and discussions and research in how the City of Edmonton has brought forward their concerns to what is effectively this bill and the cuts to municipalities through MSI funding. It's very clear that there's not a lot of support out there for the measures that this government is putting in place in terms of effectively, as far as I know, a 25% cut across the board to municipalities, especially in a time when we should be so focused on getting people back to work and supporting our local economies. When we talk about supporting the health and well-being of all Albertans and how MSI funding contributes to that very important cause, once again, it's very concerning that this government, this UCP government, is going down and going in this direction. It's just a matter of fact when we look at what's included in this and the discussions that have already taken place surrounding the proposal of MSI cuts and the proposal of Bill 56 in and outside of this legislature, that Albertans and municipalities are frightened how this might play out. And of course, when we look at MSI funding and the importance that it provides to Alberta communities, once again, if I look at the City of Edmonton and the concerns that they brought forward around their inability to support the chronically houseless in our community and the hopes that they had that this MSI funding would be an opportunity to support those people that are in our community and currently unhoused and currently looking and needing supports, especially in the middle of a pandemic when we should be doing our best to house these families and these individuals. It's rather unfortunate that this is the direction that the UCP has taken, and we can look back to the decision that our government made when we were in government to come to the table with our major municipalities very early and consult and come forward with what we saw in the big city charters and the funding that was going to be available there to our largest municipalities and the opportunities that were going to be in front of us too, whether it be house chronically homeless individuals, whether it be to support important infrastructure across our communities. For instance, in my own community of Edmonton West Henday, we have a recreation center that has been proposed by the City of Edmonton, and with that funding from the big city charters, it would have been a very realistic possibility to see such an important facility move forward. Now, I can appreciate that in the midst of a pandemic that we need to consider how we are spending our money most effectively, but I would pose that infrastructure builds and infrastructure investments like those that are proposed through whether it be the Lewis Farms Rec Center or LRT projects across our province, whether it's in Edmonton or in Calgary, that these are vital projects for us right now in the midst of this pandemic to get people back to work. As we are seeing the job losses, as we are seeing unemployment, that this government should be doing everything in their power to put Albertans back to work. And investments in that infrastructure are a very real opportunity to do that. But unfortunately, when we brought the big city charter forward, or charters forward, in our time in government, the, at the time, Wild Rose Party was willing to support that and said that it was an important initiative. During the election, they said that they stood up and they said that they would be supporting that same agreement. And once again, when they came to power, when they came into government, they completely changed their tune. And I've raised the point before, but I'll raise it again, that when our big city mayors, specifically in Calgary, saw that essentially this government was going back on that agreement that they campaigned on, that they supported when they were in opposition, he crumpled up the agreement and said it wasn't worth the paper that it was written on, essentially. And that's how Alberta families are feeling right now, whether it's on this piece of legislation or the draft curriculum or any other piece of legislation that we're seeing coming forward from this government, is that at the end of the day, the decisions that this government are making are not in the best interest of Albertans, are not doing the important work of supporting our communities at a time when they need it most. And Madam Speaker, it's truly disappointing because this government had an opportunity to come in and meet Albertans in the middle. But what we've seen so far is the complete opposite. They're going back on agreements that they formally made, whether it be on the Big City Charter, whether it be on the promise to index AISH for Albertans with disabilities in our community that find themselves unable to work. This government has completely done a 180 on many of the important decisions that Albertans, at the end of the day, voted for them because they made those commitments. And it's absolutely unfortunate. And it's not just infrastructure investments like what we are hoping to see in the Lewis Farms Rec Center. It spans across all municipal budgets, whether it be when our councillors are considering the budgets for policing, whether they're considering the budgets for supporting the chronically houseless, whether they're considering budgets for anything else, Madam Speaker, that the failure to properly support them through Bill 56, the Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021, the failure for this government to come up with a realistic plan for funding our communities, and the failure at the end of the day to support municipalities across this province is going to be felt by all Albertans. Now, when we look at other decisions that this government has made, at the same time as they're telling municipalities that they're no longer going to fairly fund them, that they're going to go back on those decisions, we can see in other areas of the provincial budget, in other areas and direction that this government has committed to or went back on, increased fees across the board, essentially, whether it be the bracket creep that this premier once campaigned against when he was with the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, complaining that rightfully so, that bracket creep is a danger to all Albertans. Whether we look at the increased property taxes that are going to be faced by Albertans because of, once again, municipalities' inability to fund important and vital services in our community because of, for one, cuts to MSI funding by this provincial government. It is going to be increased, and it is going to place even greater burdens on Alberta families. And the list is not a short list, Madam Speaker, whether we're looking at this government's unwillingness to support Albertans when it comes to insurance premiums, to essentially let the industry choose pretty much how legislation is written altogether at the end of the day, whether we're talking about increases to parks and recreation fees, whether we're talking about increases to costs for seniors, and in many instances having seniors programs cut, whether it be dental programs, whether it be optometrist programs that were once in place, and we see this government completely failing and rolling back many important services that were once available to Albertans, and in this instance seniors. Those are completely disappearing or being cut at the least, and it's incredibly unfortunate. And the same goes for education taxes that when we were in government, I believe we made sure to do our best to freeze that, to hold the line, recognizing how important it was to support municipalities with that funding, how important it was to hold the line and ensure that Alberta families could, at least in that instance, not have to worry about increases in education taxes. And here we are again, on top of all of the decisions that this government has made to cut funding for municipalities, whether it be for police specifically, we see in smaller communities or smaller municipalities across the province are going to be incredibly impacted by the decision of this government to take more of the money that is generated from things like tickets and traffic infractions. Once again, this government is giving municipalities less and at the same time is expecting more from them. And at the same time, even further, Madam Speaker, is saying that these municipalities essentially don't know how to spend their money properly, have come up with the idea of giving report cards to these municipalities to undermine their authority, to undermine the important privileges that have been put in place by those municipalities through elections, just like every one of the members here in this House. Yet this government seems to not believe that they have the same authority or right to govern in the best interest of Albertans. Now, once again, when we look through Bill 56, the Local Measure Statutes Amendment Act 2021, we see further that this government is going to force municipalities to pay for $41 million in 911 upgrades. Of course, most Albertans, if not all Albertans, are paying a fee for having access to those services. They are important services, Madam Speaker. Another file that this government is completely failing on when we look at code reds across this province, when we look at the movement to potentially centralize or change the way that these services are provided to Albertans. And I know that members on the government side have been concerned with their own government in that respect. Yet here we are, forcing municipalities, and at the end of the day, taxpayers, to front the bill for these upgrades. But in the guise of this legislation, they're trying to pass that buck on to municipalities. And very clearly, we'll come back and say, it's the municipalities' problem. Oh, I don't know why they have to continue raising taxes. But here we are. And we see the very reasons for that in this legislation and many others across the board. Now, I imagine myself and many other MLAs will have legitimate questions to ask on this, and we're very hopeful that we'll get answers, Madam Speaker. I know that the ministers are always doing their best to answer our questions, and so one of the first ones that I would pose to the government is, has any of the ministers, hopefully the finance minister, tallied up the total amount of funding that they have cut or downloaded onto municipalities or ratepayers? Of course, when we look at opportunities, whether it be infrastructure investments, whether it be trying to bring new businesses to Alberta's, we're always concerned about the rate of return on those projects and on those investments. Yet it seems very clear that this government is not concerned at looking at the compiling impacts or the combined impacts of the decisions that they're making. And so hopefully they can prove me wrong and let us know how much so far we've seen cut from the total amount of funding that they've downloaded onto municipalities. It's a very important question. We've seen a lot of bills, I've laid out a few of them, or a lot of changes over the last couple of years from this UCP government that are being downloaded onto municipalities, onto ratepayers, and I think it's important and prudent that this government brings those numbers forward to show Albertans the true cost of electing this government. I think it's a very important point to make. And even further, I would have to ask how the UCP government expects Albertans to afford paying higher property taxes. Once again, as the government cuts funding from municipalities, those cities are going to be forced to come up with that money. And one of the few ways that they have to do that is by increasing property taxes, which I can only imagine is going to happen in many municipalities across the province. And so those are just a few of the questions I have, questions that I hope this government can answer as we continue the debate this evening on this piece of legislation, which is essentially this government going back on many of the promises that they made in opposition during the election and even to more recently. And it's very frustrating because I think of how this bill is going to impact Albertans and Edmontonians I think about the opportunities that we had, whether through the work of End Poverty Edmonton or other organizations, nonprofits in our community that are desperately trying to support Albertans and Edmontonians in a time when they are simply looking for any glimmer of hope on the horizon. And unfortunately, through Bill 56, as we've seen through many other pieces of legislation from this government, it doesn't seem to be there. It doesn't seem to be in the cards, Madam Speaker. Now, when we look at the cuts in MSI, earlier I said 25%, just looking here further, it looks to be amounting to more like 36%.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate? Bill 56 in second reading, the Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my privilege to stand tonight and speak to Bill 56, the Local Measures Act. This legislation amends the Local Government Fiscal Framework Act to align changes to the Local Government Fiscal Framework and the Municipal Sustainability Initiative with Budget 2021. It also modernizes Alberta's 911 technology through amendments to the Emergency 911 Act. The Local Measures Act supports Budget 21 by extending MSI funding to 2023-2024 to provide front-loaded and flexible capital funding for municipalities. As we've been saying following Budget 2021 and even long before, it's time to get this province's deficit under control through sustainable, responsible, and gradual processes. Budget 2021 directs record spending where it is most needed, like health and capital funding, but also creates a roadmap to gradually cut back on programs like the Municipality Sustainability Initiative, or MSI. The key word here is gradual. MSI funding has been crucial for Alberta communities through this pandemic. Lethbridge has benefited greatly from MSI funding, where we received just under $25 million in 2020. To be specific, we were allocated just over $20 million for MSI capital funding and over $600,000 in MSI operating funding. Projects like the renovation to the Lethbridge Airport and construction of a new fire hall in the West Lethbridge, as well as enhancement of the shooting sports facility, road and intersection upgrades, all made possible through MSI funding. This does not include additional, special, and targeted funding for Exhibition Park, the Agri-Food Hub. Budget 2021 sets a framework for Alberta living within its means. Bill 56 will reduce MSI funding by 25% over the next 3 years on an average of $722 million per year as Alberta lives within its means. It is important to note that this is a gradual process and not a sudden cut to this program. Vital projects that require funding through MSI will still be given attention that they need. Over the next 3 years, the MSI funding will be reflected as follows: $1.196 billion in 2021-22, and then 2 years of $485 million. Alberta's government provided $500 million to municipalities under the Municipal Stimulus Program in 2021 as part of Alberta's recovery plan, and much of that spending will be done in 2021 and the years following. As I said before, this has been vital to Lethbridge's development, and I firmly believe that the previous investment spending will make municipalities more sustainable and economically independent, which will also coincide and allow those projects to carry on over the next 3 years. Madam Speaker, Bill 56 will also modernize and update the 911 system for the first time in nearly 30 years to ensure Albertans continue to have safe, reliable services when they call or text 911 during an emergency. Texting 911 will offer a confidential and silent way of accessing emergency supports for those in sensitive situations where calling may not be an option. I do not want to imagine all the scenarios that this will be used in, but I am encouraged by the fact that many more Albertans will be able to access emergency services in situations where they could not before. Additionally, this bill will update technology used by Alberta's 911 system. The federal government mandated through the Canadian Radio Television Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, that Canada's 911 system be upgraded to the next generation 911 technology by March 30th, 2024. Through the upgrades provided in Bill 56, next generation 911 will improve location accuracy to calls to verify a caller's address or device location. This is vital in helping locate callers in rural and remote areas, and can also be determined the height of the call, for example, in a taller building in a larger center. This technology will leverage the growth of broadband in areas underserved by cell coverage to make 911 calling much easier. Even in areas with poor cell phone coverage, if the area has broadband or Wi-Fi coverage, the call will be processed through that network using this new technology. If contacting 911 via text or a pin drop or user-initiated location sharing will not be required, since the location will be provided automatically as long as the caller has some phone reception, which is done through satellite GPS. Madam Speaker, the safety of Albertans is of utmost importance. Better, more reliable access to 911 services ensure the safety of Albertans in nearly every imaginable and unimaginable situation. To cover the cost of the change, phone bills will see an increase related to first responders. 911 service will work better regardless of who answers the phone. Bill 56, the Local Measures Act, sets a clear direction to address responsible spending for municipal supports and gives us the opportunity to upgrade our critical 911 services and expand its efficacy. Given the commitment to Alberta's economic future and the safety of Albertans outlined in this legislation, I support this bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable member, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any members wishing to join debate in second reading of Bill 56, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise tonight to speak to Bill 56, the Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021. But first, I would just like to follow my tradition of just giving a huge thank you to all of our first responders, all of our frontline workers, and all of those that are tirelessly working to ensure that we're safe from the pandemic that is happening globally. So yeah, when we're talking about municipalities, this is literally something that impacts every corner of our province. Whether you live up north, central, or southern Alberta, this piece of legislation is going to impact your municipality's ability to meet your needs. What this bill proposes is likely going to be an increase to Albertans in terms of taxes. They're cutting the municipalities' funding. We're hearing from municipalities all across the province, in rural Alberta, in the cities, talking about the concerns that they have with the complete destruction of funding for municipalities. Now, I'm the culture critic, and I've worked with organizations that support communities all across the province, whether it's our egg societies or community leagues. They're really the heart of our province, and it's what so many Albertans rely on. And we have heard over and over and over that community leagues are struggling. So community leagues rely on funding from many different venues. They look to the community that they live in. So if they're from Edmonton, they rely on the Edmonton community. They rely on the participants of that community, so the people that are coming to the community leagues. They look to the city that provides the structure where they are. They look to them for funding. They look to the province for funding and support. And unfortunately, we've seen their revenue opportunities incredibly decreased. They can't hold events anymore. So where they used to have perhaps a spring fair or carnival or an Easter egg hunt, they can't do those things because of COVID and the restrictions. They used to be able to rely on casino funding. Here we have a government that took casino funding, the lottery fund, and put it in general revenue, and it's sitting there. Community leagues don't have access to it. Nonprofits don't have access to it. So when you have a community league that is struggling, let's say the town of Cochrane, who has identified, one of the councillors there, Tara McFadden, has identified the incredible importance of community recreational infrastructure. They can't access the regular revenue streams that they've relied on. And so when you look at Bill 56 and how it's absolutely gutting our Alberta municipalities, how are these communities supposed to function? They rely on so many different avenues of income and support that they can't access. They can't host fundraisers. They can't have a casino because the casinos aren't open. They can't ask their community members to come together to support. People want to do something. They want to contribute. So when you have a bill like Bill 56 that's continuing to gut municipalities more, that means those payments are falling onto that direct municipality. Their infrastructure is crumbling. We hear stories from all across the province. I'm sure every member in this room has some sort of facility that is in dire straits. Some facility that the community relies on needs support. And unfortunately, this government has set up nothing in this budget to actually support communities, to support those gathering places that are going to be the first place to open when the COVID restrictions start lifting. That's going to be the first responders in the community that's going to want to have people come together. They're going to want to go to their community league. They're going to want to be able to go to their recreational center. But if they're falling apart, Madam Speaker, and the funding isn't being supported by the province, and now with cuts to the municipalities, it's not going to be supported by the municipality, what's going to happen to these communities? It's very, very, very frustrating when you hear so many volunteers that want to be able to support and give back. So many people that want to come together and help fix the local skating rink that's falling apart. Or they want to build that park that is falling apart, and they can't. They don't have access to the support through the government. They don't have funds that are available. It's a time right now where community wants to come together, and they can't. We see proposals coming forward from community leagues and organizations all across the province with ideas of how to get their infrastructure updated. They talk about being able to create jobs, and they talk about being able to put local people back to work, that community league that needs a new floor, or maybe where the furnace system needs an upgrade, or the lighting, or their sound system. When you're not worried about having the venue booked for weddings and anniversaries and birthday parties, now is the perfect time to get into those facilities and upgrade. They don't have to be closed, they're already closed. People, the local plumber, the local electrician that those community leagues rely on all the time, are struggling. And when you look at Bill 56, you're hearing outcries from municipal leaders all across the province saying they need help. Now is the time to invest in those projects. Now is the time to get those people in our communities back to work. Those small businesses that rely on the work that their community league provides, that their recreation structure offers. We hear so many community leagues that are trying to be creative. They're trying to create opportunities for people to gather, whether it's on Zoom or they're doing some sort of virtual scavenger hunt. They're trying to create a space that allows community to come together. But when we're no longer under these restrictions, people want to go back to their home base. They want to be able to go back to those buildings and those facilities that they've relied on. That sense of home, that sense of comfort. The drop-in center where teenagers would drop in. Those kids that had nowhere to go, but knew on a Friday night that their community center offered a drop-in for them to go hang out with some pretty cool adults, some peers that could relate to them. That's not happening. And we're at risk of losing those facilities if we're going to continue to cut our municipalities. Tara McFadden from Cochrane is a town councillor, and she had said that, I quote, "I feel our recreation infrastructure has fallen behind and is something we really need to focus upon. It's become apparent through COVID just how important our recreation is, not only for our physical health, but our emotional well-being, and how it brings the community together." They talk about the importance of having the MSI funding being supported and reliable, and things like their community centers, their recreation centers, are at risk because of these cuts. A 25% cut to the MSI is huge. That has a major impact. We've heard from rural communities who are concerned that they just aren't viable. We are at risk of losing them. This is something that our government leaders, I'm sure, are hearing. We're hearing it on this side of the House. We know that so many are saying, you know, we don't know what to do. We keep reaching out. People are making phone calls, they're sending emails, they're sending letters, they're sending letter petitions. We see communities going to the media to talk about their concerns because they're saying this government isn't listening. On one hand, this government is saying they want to create jobs. But when you take money away from municipalities, you're taking away their ability to actually create jobs by supporting infrastructure. One of the best ways to get people in your community back to work is building infrastructure, repairing infrastructure. And this cut under the Bill 56 is really, really frightening. And the government isn't listening. We hear from community leaders all across the province expressing their concerns. They want to be listened to. They're talking about what's going to happen to the people that they serve. What it means, unfortunately, is probably increased property taxes, probably cuts to services, and again, the actual viability of some of these municipalities. Some of these municipalities are in such debt, and making a further cut could actually threaten their viability, Madam Speaker. This is something that I think this government really needs to consider when they're making these cuts. When we talk about the upgrade for 911, so what this piece of legislation is doing is it's taking a technology upgrade that has to occur, and it's putting the cost on the municipality without provincial support. So what does that mean? It means that if you're a family of 4, you're likely going to pay an additional $25 a year because of this bill. In a time when Albertans aren't working, in a time of a pandemic, when we see that this government took away the caps on insurance, their insurance rates are going up. All of their spending is increasing because this government isn't protecting the average Albertan. They're making all of these decisions that are having dire impacts on families. We look at the pleas that this side of the House has made to look at affordable childcare so that 2 members of a household can return to the workforce if possible. They can't afford childcare. Car insurance rates are going up. Now cell phone rates are going up. The reality is, Madam Speaker, is that more and more people in a household have a cell phone. Children are getting cell phones because they're walking to and from school, and parents want them to be able to be in touch with them. So that's a fee for safety that now is being downloaded onto a family. The government isn't supporting the upgrade for the 911 system to the municipalities. They're asking the municipalities, not even asking, this bill tells the municipalities they're paying for it. So in a time when Albertans are really struggling, I'm very confused how this government can hear these horrific stories, because I know they're hearing them. We're hearing them. We hear heart-wrenching stories of the impacts that this COVID pandemic has had on families. We hear people pleading for support, pleading for access to services, doing simple things like stopping putting an insurance cap so that people's rates aren't tripling in some instances. We look at utilities and the skyrocketing bills that people are receiving. People shouldn't have to consider paying for a cell phone, paying for heat and water, or groceries. It's just, I'm very confused when we have people who are elected to represent their municipalities all across this province coming together to express concern to a government, and the government isn't listening. These are elected officials that are representing their municipalities across the entire province. It's not just one area of Edmonton, one area of Calgary. The entire province is being impacted by these decisions. And leaders that were elected to represent their communities are coming forward saying, we have concerns. Why aren't we listening? It's very concerning to me, Madam Speaker, when we have a government that is just putting through legislation without considering the consequence of that. It's very upsetting to have so many people that are in positions of being of service to their community and still not being heard. They're still not being listened to. The average Albertan is worried. They hear concerns about safety. They hear concerns about their children in school, about their loved ones in seniors' homes. And we're just not seeing anything in this piece of legislation that actually is supportive of a municipality. And I would like to know from the government who they're listening to. How do they speak to these elected officials? Thank you.
Honourable member standing under 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate? The honourable member for Fort Saskatchewan, Vegreville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm honoured to be speaking on Bill 56, the Local Measures Act. I'm particularly honoured to be speaking about the modernization of Alberta's 911 technology through amendments to the Emergency 911 Act. The 911 system is in desperate need of modernization because it is nearly 30 years old, and it's been 30 years since it's been updated. Albertans need to know that they can continue to have safe, reliable services when they call or text 911 during an emergency. Yes, I did say text. Once the system upgrades are complete, Albertans will be able to text 911 in situations where they cannot call. This will be very useful in situations such as if a victim of domestic abuse needs to get a hold of 911. I've seen many scenarios where quietly texting 911 would be much more beneficial. Women walking at night might keep a 911 message written out, and all it takes is a tap of send if someone were to attack, stalk, or in any way harm them. It adds a sense of security, and I'm very glad that this change has been made. It is also more in line with the younger generation, where they might be too anxious to get on the phone with 911 in the case of an emergency. This technology upgrade is also very affordable, as it will only cost 7 cents extra to phone bills, which will be effective September 1st of this year. These technology upgrades will only have an effect on the 911 emergency dispatch callers and will not affect EMS, policing, firefighters, or anything else related to first responders. These changes will make it better for 911 dispatch services to work better, regardless who answers the phone. These much-needed upgrades to the emergency services are also due soon. The federal government, through the Canadian Radio Television Telecommunications Commission, also known as the CRTC, has mandated that Canada's 911 system be upgraded to next-generation 911 technology by March 30th of 2024. This is in line with other provinces and is crucial to cover the cost of the system's upgrades. For example, Saskatchewan has announced that their levy will be $1.88 per month due to differences in provincial systems. Next Generation 911 will improve location accuracy of calls to verify a caller's civic address or device location. This will also help with locating callers in rural or remote areas and determine the height of a call, for example, in a tall building in an urban setting. With this technology, 911 services will be able to quickly and accurately respond to emergency situations more efficiently. Upgrading this technology will be upgrading the range for the broadband in areas that are underserviced by cell phone service providers. Even in areas with poor or very little cell phone coverage, if the area has broadband or Wi-Fi coverage, the 911 call will be processed through the network under the Next Generation 911. I'm very excited for this next generation of 911 services. This is a much-needed change. Our province and the world have been developing amazing technology over the past 30 years, and it's about time that our systems, especially emergency systems, reflect these times. Using GPS signals when calling or texting 911 will allow emergency responders to accurately find you in an emergency situation. There would be, there would not be even a need to send a PIN location drops through text. Keeping Albertans safe is our #1 priority. By having an updated and unique system, we are protecting the safety and security of Albertans, which is a core government responsibility. There are also many stakeholders who agree with this change. The Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services said, quote, texting and enhanced 911 access offers survivors of domestic and sexual violence a safe and discreet option to reach out. Dale McPhee, the president of Alberta Association of Chiefs of Police, said, quote, enhancing access to Alberta's 911 centers will improve emergency service response. It's a game changer for the public safety and first responders. I think it is very important to hear from stakeholders that work with people who may need to use the emergency services and emergency responders who may be indirectly affected. I am very proud of this bill and the amazing work that Alberta's government has done to try to modernize our emergency response system. I believe that this will help a lot of Albertans who are in sensitive and scary situations who will need to discreetly text 911. I also am in favor of the wide range that the 911 services will be able to reach with the next generation 911 system. Bill 56, the Local Measures Act, is much needed legislation, and I'm glad to support and urge all MLAs in the Legislative Assembly to vote in favor of this bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Well, members, just take a moment to remind all members of this House, if you would like to have a conversation, perhaps the members' lounge is a good place to do that. Sometimes talking with these masks on makes you talk a little louder, and I can't hear the speakers. Standing Order 29-2A is currently available. Are there any members wishing to speak? Seeing none, are there any members wishing to join debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Beverly Clarview.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I will endeavour to enunciate as much as I can for our friends up in Hansard, recognizing that a newfound challenge for them. Madam Speaker, it's my honour to rise and speak to Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act. And Madam Speaker, I won't beat around the bush. I feel that this bill is terrible, quite frankly, Madam Speaker, and I'll talk about why. First of all, this is the first bill since under former Premier Ed Stelmach, who codified MSI, or Municipal Sustainability Initiatives for municipalities, in order to begin the conversation to deliver on predictable, sustainable funding, which is something that municipalities have been asking governments for since they were first created through legislation. Now, for those Albertans watching at home who don't realize this, municipalities actually exist through provincial legislation, but a very, very important order of government. And I will say that as I go through my comments on this bill in second reading, Madam Speaker, I will juxtapose the previous government's support and programs and commitment to municipalities versus this current piece of legislation and the current government, who at every turn is cutting budgets to municipalities while putting more and more of the burden of costs of programs and services onto those municipalities. This was a trick, Madam Speaker, that the former Premier Ralph Klein did, and did very, very well, where he ended up, I mean, I love when those of the former Wild Rose Party talk and show the image of Ralph Klein with the paid in full on the check. The reality is it wasn't. So I encourage you to go back and do your homework, because what he effectively did was transfer the costs from the provincial ledger, provincial budget, onto municipalities. Great accounting game, fantastic. Accountants everywhere said, bravo, way to go. You actually didn't pay off the debt. You transferred it to another order of government and said, now it's your problem. Oh, but we're paid in full. No, you're not. You're actually not. And so I encourage members of the front bench to stand up and speak on the record. I'd love to engage back and forth on this discussion point, because it's irksome, Madam Speaker, that Apparently I'm using language that is confusing some of colleagues on both sides of the House. Irksome, have we not heard this before in the chamber? Goodness gracious, Madam Speaker. Through you to the members, please let me choose my vocabulary at will. It's frustrating, Madam Speaker, that the message was that the province had gotten itself out of debt, and the reality is it hadn't. It was transferred to a different order of government. And so, you know, what I find interesting, Madam Speaker, when I was first elected and I engaged with municipal leaders around the province and talked to them about some of the issues and challenges they're facing, a reality that many councillors from urban centres to rural counties to MDs all talked about was the fact that 90%, 90, of services that are delivered on behalf of government are actually delivered at the municipal level. And so the challenge that our municipalities have is they do not have the financial tools or instruments that the province or the federal government does in order to generate revenue in order to deliver those services. And so municipalities really have only a couple of tools available. The first one, and primarily, being your property taxes, which of course is a regressive tax that members of this side of the House have argued time and time again. But the fact of the matter is they have very few tools at their disposal in order to deliver critical services like fire and policing that deal with infrastructure, taking care of our roads, our bridges, clearing snow, filling potholes. I mean, something that everyone who drives in the city, including all members of this chamber, whether or not they live in Edmonton, spend enough time here to know that these are challenges that the city faces. However, despite the fact that municipalities deliver 90% of the services, they have access to, I think it's a tenth of the financial tools that the province or the federal government does. And so at a time where we are facing unprecedented challenges, unprecedented unemployment numbers, sustained, that this government is bringing forward a piece of legislation that is actually cutting the very budgets of the order of government that delivers the most services directly to citizens. And we're talking about citizens everywhere, Madam Speaker, including in Airdrie, in Calgary, in Cochrane, in Red Deer, all over the province, Madam Speaker. And so it is extremely frustrating and not surprising, quite frankly, that there are a number, in fact, a long list of locally elected officials who are speaking out against this bill, talking about the fact that this is now legislating and codifying hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts to municipalities. So, the part that is the most frustrating, Madam Speaker, is that the provincial government can do this, cut their budgets, and then step back, and when municipalities say we have no choice but to raise property taxes, the provincial government attacks them, as we've seen from the former Minister of Municipal Affairs, who would attack municipalities over and over and over again for trying to deliver the very services that the citizens that they were elected to represent elected them for. Because, Madam Speaker, municipalities cannot run deficits. Now, that's a fascinating concept, because I loved getting into discussions with the former Wild Rose leader, Danielle Smith, about deficits. Because she hates deficits, but good for her for buying her house with $300,000 cash. Oh, wait a minute, no, she didn't. No, at least I don't know, to be honest. But it's unlikely she did. Has anyone in this chamber purchased a house with your savings? I doubt it. An inheritance doesn't count.
Honourable member, I'll just remind you to direct your comments through the chair.
They're through you to all members. My point is not to go after Danielle Smith. In fact, everyone in this chamber should know that I have a great rapport with her and I have always. My point is that I don't know personally of any Albertans who can afford to buy a house without having to take a mortgage or borrow. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. I'm saying I don't know of any. Not in my circles, not in my friends, not in the people that I know. And so the point is, there is a difference, Madam Speaker, between good debt and bad debt. And my point is that the fact that municipalities don't have access to debt and borrowing the way the other orders of government do puts them at a significant disadvantage. The reality, and government members, through you, Madam Speaker, by all means, jump up. If the government of Alberta could not access deficit funding, how would they possibly provide supports for anyone through COVID? Now, I'm not trying to debate the fact that their supports through COVID have been pathetic at best. That's not the point. The point is municipalities don't have that luxury. It's not even a luxury. They don't have that tool available. And so they're the order of government that provides the most services directly to citizens. They have the fewest tools available to be able to access dollars to provide those services that Albertans rely on and depend on. Every member in this chamber represents at least one municipality, some dozens, that all are expected to provide services. Services to help citizens, services to help businesses, to ensure that goods flow in and out of our province. They're absolutely necessary, Madam Speaker. And so any bill that actively looks to significantly reduce the budget of these municipalities to then turn and say, yeah, now we want you to not only continue to provide the level of service that you have, you need to actually increase those services because Alberta, our population is constantly increasing. There is a growing constant demand for all services provided at all orders of government. So it's frustrating. I mean, in addition, this bill is forcing municipalities to pay for the 911 upgrades that this government has foisted upon municipalities. Foisted. Oh, I chose that word carefully. You know why, Madam Speaker? Because municipalities didn't ask for it. They didn't want it. And we know from studies that this consolidated service is led to longer response times. Don't take my word for it. Talk to fire, talk to EMS, talk to police, talk to the experts. I mean, this is sadly an ongoing trend that this government continues to introduce legislation and make decisions without consulting the very experts. Or the government is, and quite frankly, doesn't care what they say. It's one or the other. Because when it comes to 911, we know that it is not leading to better outcomes. And members of this chamber should know that in my time, since I was first elected, I will be the first member to give credit where credit's due to any government, regardless of political stripes. But I also will be critical of any government that makes decisions that are not in the best interests of the citizens of this province and are leading with direct outcomes. I urge the government, through you, Madam Speaker, to table documents that show that 911 service calls are going to be improved and have been improved and enhanced, wait times reduced through this centralization of 911. because every single municipally elected official I've talked to has provided documents that show that those times have grown. So through this bill, Madam Speaker, the government of Alberta has increased costs to municipalities by $41 million at the same time as making massive cuts to their budgets. And then has the audacity, some members of this government, to blame municipal leaders for their budgeting and to criticize them. This government cut the policing line item through at least one budget, I believe it was 2 budgets, and then turned around and blamed municipalities, saying, we didn't cut the police budget, you're in charge of the budget, you make those decisions. Madam Speaker, some would call that scapegoating. I do have to repeat that so Hansard picks it up. My colleague from Edmonton Castle Downs just said, or a Jedi mind trick. Either way, Madam Speaker, I'm not trying to make light of the fact that the cuts that are being proposed through this bill are unacceptable. And when members of the government say to Albertans, we don't have the money, we have to make these cuts, I ask the government to look at spending like the $30 million a year to the war room that has been a joke to the international community. In fact, it's hurting investment in Alberta. And I get the Minister of Energy will stand up and defend this. But I promise you, Madam Speaker, in a few years from now, when there are third-party audits of the war room, it will come to show.
Member Standing Order 29-2A is available. The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened to my colleague with interest, and it is irksome to see government cut municipalities' funding and force their agenda onto municipalities. So I would ask my colleague, he was finishing up about audits of energy war room. So if you would like to comment further on that one.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Beverly Clareview.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate my colleague on the opposite side from Karsten Sixica is itching to get into this debate. I thank you, sir, for your eagerness to get in. I do want to thank my colleague, the member for Calgary-McCall. We could make an Edmonton-McCall, too. For his question. And so, Madam Speaker, I will endeavor to move much more quickly. I mean, there's a number of questions that I have for the government on this piece of legislation, and I do hope that in Committee of the Whole, the Minister and his colleagues can respond to some, if not all, of these questions, because they are being asked to us, the official opposition, on behalf of Albertans. And so my first question is, has the government tallied up the total amount of funding that they've either cut or downloaded to municipalities? Now, I appreciate the fact that we will get into a debate over the definition of downloaded. But my point is this, Madam Speaker. If municipalities are given new responsibilities and new fiscal burdens or challenges that are placed on them for their new responsibilities, has the government kept track of that dollar amount? I would argue that the civil service has, having worked directly with many of Alberta's finest. I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that the ministry would have access to those numbers, and would love to hear from the government as far as what the total is on how much funding they've cut. I'm curious to know, and I would love to see some internal documents of the government as far as how they expect Albertans to pay for increased property taxes. And here's the kicker, Madam Speaker. I really enjoyed this when we were government. When the UCP opposition would call for budget cuts in question period. Let's say question 3. And then in question 6, a member would get up and talk about how important it is to have a school in his or her riding. Wonderful. Did you listen to question number 3? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't make massive cuts to the budget and then talk about investing in infrastructure, in schools, in roads, in culverts, in hospitals. And so that anomaly or that contradiction was never justified, accounted for, but it was frustrating to hear. The fact that through this bill, MSI is being cut significantly at the same time that the government's asking municipalities to pay more for infrastructure. Here's another one. The fact that families are going to have to pay more on their cell phone bills. I wished the line item on their bill would actually say, brought to you by the UCP government of Alberta. Because it should. Because the fact of the matter is, this government has shown through action that they will continue to nickel and dime Albertans. You can't say in good conscience, we're not raising taxes on you, and then you increase personal income taxes through the creep. And I welcome any debate on the fact of, no, we're not raising personal income taxes. You remove the bracket. So anybody that gets increases for cost of living inflation and moves into a next bracket, you've increased taxes on them. You can wordsmith the heck out of this all day long. Let's play semantics. You've increased cost. You've increased park fees. You've increased insurance rates.
Honourable members, will just remind all members of this House to direct their comments through the chair. I see the Honourable Member for Carson Siksika on second reading of Bill 56.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is an honor to rise today, or rather this evening, and speak on this bill, Bill 56, the Local Measures Act. Now, I have to start by thanking the member opposite from Edmonton and Beverly Clareview for his remarks. While we do disagree, I also like to give that member credit. He always comes prepared, ready to speak, and actually gives remarks I think are fulsome and add to the debate, especially raise the level of decorum. And I mean that with all sincerity, just so we're very clear. I did find certain parts of his speech a bit vexing. That I'll see you works and raise you vexing. About the issue of 911. So if we take a trip down memory lane not that long ago, back to about a year ago, there was an incident in Oregon, Ohio. Now, some of you may have read about this in the news, where a woman dialed 911 to order a pizza. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, it goes, and I'm paraphrasing here, where the woman dialed 911 to order a pizza. The dispatcher, who had been working there for, I think, about 13 years, was quite curious as to what this was about. But over his years of experience, realized the tone of the lady's voice who was calling, that she was not ordering a pizza, but was in fact in distress. And it was a domestic violence call. And because of this dispatcher's experience in the job and ability to cipher through some of the pizza order, frankly, they were able to dispatch someone to that scene and help this lady. Now, the reason why I say this, Madam Speaker, is because this is an instance where having an updated 911 service that would allow for text messaging rather than phone calling would be quite beneficial. And the reality here is the federal government has mandated through the CRTC, which is the Canadian Radio, Television, Telecommunications Commission, that Canada's 911 systems must be upgraded, next generation, by March 30th, 2024. This is a necessity for us, Madam Speaker. This is something that's being mandated by the federal government, something our province is responding to. And I'm grateful for the minister for responding in this way. I recognize that there are costs associated with this that will be reflected on cellular bills, but I do believe that compared to other jurisdictions, this is a marginal cost. I could be mistaken again, and I don't want to assume too much, but I know Saskatchewan's numbers are higher than ours. And again, this is not an attempt by the provincial government to gouge cell phone payers, but rather to offset the cost of updating the 911 system. So I appreciate the sentiment from members opposite on this and showing genuine concern for taxpayers across the province. But the reality is, this is not a substantial increase in our bills. The next thing is the issue of MSI. Now, I know that there is a real concern from the members opposite about MSI and the decrease over the next 3 years of 25%. So let me say that for the record here, as it has been already said this evening, that MSI will reflect in the following next 3 years, $1.196 billion in 2021-22, $485 million 22-23, and $485 million in 23-24. Alberta's government is front-loading MSI now because, as the member opposite already stated, in times like this, municipal projects are a great way to get people working and to improve infrastructure so that as we climb out of this difficult time that we are in with the pandemic, that we have the infrastructure to excel and do as many of the financial institutions in this province have already said we will do, which is lead the country in economic growth. Now, I think that this is a tremendous point of, it's a great bragging part, or a great bragging point for this province. The fact that we are in what I think is probably the worst crisis that this province has seen in this generation. And though I'm quite young, I think relatively, I can't think of anything else that was probably more devastating than this. But you're talking about a triple black swan event, Madam Speaker, where you have a number of problems, including the crash of oil, this pandemic, and it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart, Madam Speaker, to see the devastation across the country and across the world that this pandemic has caused, and the need to respond to it. But there is hope, Madam Speaker. There is hope indeed that Alberta has taken a measured approach to responding to the pandemic to ensure that when we are able to get out of this difficult time, we will in fact lead the country in economic growth. And businesses across Canada are seeing that. So the MSI funding, if I can go back to that, to again make the point from the members opposite, which is front-loading MSI so municipalities can take care of projects they've been having, that they've been waiting for in the wing for quite some time, but maybe didn't have the resources for at the moment. So all of this to say that no matter which way you cut it, Alberta and the rest of the country of Canada are certainly in very difficult times. And we must be measured in our approach to ensure that we're protecting the lives and the livelihoods of Albertans, while also preparing ourselves for an economic recovery. And I think we have done a very good job of that, Madam Speaker. And as I have already stated, several financial institutions, including the Conference Board of Canada, have said that Alberta will lead the country in economic growth. I applaud the Premier for the measures he's taken. I applaud the ministers associated with this, helping to get us back in this economic recovery. And I applaud the minister for bringing forth this bill to make the necessary changes that we need to see in Alberta. So with that, Madam Speaker, I will take my seat.
Well, member standing order 29 2A is available. Seeing none, members wishing to join debate in second reading of Bill 56, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise and speak to second reading of the Local Measure Statutes Amendment Act. I just want to actually follow up on the comment that the Honourable Member just finished on, which is around the economic growth of Alberta. Something that I think we've been seeing happening over the last couple of weeks, months, is the government continuously standing up and saying, well, the banks say that we're going to lead in economic growth across the country. There's a line that the government continues to not speak about, and that is the fact that we lost so many jobs and our economics outlook in Alberta was so poor over the last year. That the economic growth that we're seeing is actually us catching up with the rest of the country. It's not leading in the sense of we're going to create way more than anywhere else in the country. All the banks are saying is, oh, Alberta's going to slowly start to catch up to everywhere else and start to actually get back online with the jobs that they should have had 8 months ago. So although it is a line item or a line that the banks will use around economic growth, for sure, we're not going to be where we were, though. We may be leading the country right now, but that's only because we're trying to get the jobs back that we lost. So there's no win in that statement. So when we look at this Local Measure Statutes Amendment Act, and we look at the fact that this government continues to cut supports to Albertans at a time when they need them most, in every area. We see it right now with municipalities who are providing the basic supports to Albertans at a time when many of them aren't working, when many of them need mental health supports, when many of them need access to parks and to outdoor activities so that they can get out of their house and be social. Many live on their own who don't have the ability to spend time with other people. And so the very infrastructure that these municipalities are providing right now are what is a major part of what is keeping many of our Albertans healthy. And yet, what we see this government want to do is to cut those supports. And you know, it parallels with something else that happened within this budget, which is around ag societies. And I'm sure the Minister of Forestry and Agriculture can speak to this. There was a significant push by the minister to try to cut ag society funding within the budget. Ag societies, as many of our rural communities know, are the providers of many of the services that municipalities provide their citizens. They build the pools, they provide the rodeos, they do the skate rinks, they do all of they are volunteers that run all of these infrastructures that many of our smaller municipalities rely on to be able to make sure that Albertans have access to those recreational activities. So not only was the government planning on cutting the municipality's support and funding for the basic services that municipalities are trying to provide, but they were also then going to cut the funding for ag societies that also provide those supports. And so we were seeing basically all services that Albertans access for recreational supports, many of their social networks, the way that we build communities in this province, the way we bring people together, this government was going to cut their funding. And so it is a fundamental issue when we think about the overall health of Albertans. And you know, I've heard many of the members talk about 911, and while this is an important part of this bill, well, this is where the cognitive disconnect is so apparent. You want people to be healthy, you want people to be able to have access to support. I wanted to ump up the scramble game, so thought I'd add that one in there, with cognitive dissonance. But the reality of it is that if people aren't healthy and they're not doing well, then they will be accessing 911. And so why wouldn't we put structures in place? Why wouldn't we fund municipalities to make sure that they can provide those community supports, that they can make sure that people have access to transportation, that people have access to recreational activities, to access to counseling services, all of those things that are provided under MSI, so that hopefully they wouldn't need to access 911 calls. But then on top of that, if they do have to now call 911, depending on where they live in the province, the service that they're going to receive isn't even going to be in their community. Calgary has spoken out about how changing 911 to EMS, or from EMS isn't something that they want. Red Deer and Red Deer County has spoken out about the fact that they do not support the changes to 911. Lethbridge has spoken out. The Lethbridge mayor has spoken out, and I can quote it if the member across would like me to. Wood Buffalo has also spoken out. We've seen mayors after mayor after mayor who met with the Minister of Health to say changes to this will cost seconds of response times, which could potentially cost a life. So why are you doing it? Response? Well, we want to do it to save money. Okay. Well, then why is the 911 service fee going from 44 cents to 95 cents on everybody's cell phone? $17 million annually is what 44 cents brings in under 911 service charges right now, going up to $41 million next year. $41 million. And what is it supposed to be saving to be moving out of these rural communities? The 911 services, 6 million maybe? So again, cognitive dissonance doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't add up. So because of that, Madam Speaker, I have a reasoned amendment that I would like to table. And the amendment reads as following, and I do have the requisite copies. I will read into the record while it's being sent out, or just one copy to you.
Wait till I have a copy, please.
You need the original probably with you, Beth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be known as Amendment RA1. Honourable member, just note, moving on behalf of another member.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I rise to move RA1 on behalf of the Honourable Member for Lethbridge West to move that the motion of second reading of Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021, be amended by deleting all of the words after that and substituting the following. Bill 56, Local Measure Statutes Amendment Act 2021 be not now read a second time, because the Assembly is of the view that municipalities cannot sustain the reduction in funding proposed by the bill without making substantial cuts to services or substantial increases to property taxes. So again, Madam Speaker, I did see a member opposite shaking his head when I mentioned the Mayor of Lethbridge having a concern around the 911 changes. So I'll table this tomorrow. But it is an article by the CBC. Lethbridge Mayor Chris Spearman says that they've appealed to Premier Jason Kenney to overrule Alberta Health Services and keep the current municipal system, but there's been no reply. We have a minister who is ignoring the best practice and choosing to impose a system that their bureaucrats have long desired, which is not in the interest of Albertans. So my appeal to the Premier Kenney, overrule your health minister or change the health minister, as he's not listening to Albertans. In a letter to the mayors in October, Health Minister Tyler Shandro, Honourable Member, Health Minister, I retract the name, said he has reviewed the situation and decided to proceed. My decision is not to overturn AHS's decision, and I retract the minister's name. So again, Madam Speaker, there's one example right there. We obviously have some other examples from Grand Prairie, Medicine Hat, where there's been comments made around the changes to 911. So again, I think it's been very clear, and I think this is where the fundamental difference really starts to show itself, is that the opposition here clearly continues to listen and hear from the concerns from the different mayors, Albertans, around these very issues. We know that ensuring that there is appropriate and stable funding for municipalities is what keeps our communities healthy and vibrant. That would be the same for agriculture or ag societies, and the fact that we want to make sure that ag societies are funded, because if the municipality is building the infrastructure, the volunteers are the ones that are running it. We have some other quotes here from the Reeve of Ponoka County. Points out that the rural municipalities are already struggling with millions of dollars in unpaid property taxes owed by certain oil and gas companies. Quote, in some municipalities, unpaid tax amounts are so high that service levels are being reduced, municipal staff are being laid off, and serious discussions are occurring about whether the municipalities can continue to function. The ability of farmers to get to field to move large volumes of good in short periods of time requires serious infrastructure investment, he said. One thing we've seen is a tremendous size of machinery, tremendous volumes that are being moved out of Alberta agriculture on our roads, and our road designs need to be kept up with tremendous growth. That's a pretty serious issue, I would say, And of course, that was in the producer, and I can get a copy of that and table that as well. But when we're looking at our rural municipalities and the fact that, and I'm sure the Minister of Agriculture would also speak to this, is when you're trying to move your grain and you can't move your grain because the roads have washed away, or because the infrastructure is not in place, the oil hasn't been put down. It creates a problem. It creates a problem for farmers to get their product to market. Well, municipalities aren't going to have the money to keep those road systems up. We're going to see the same issue when the toll bridges start coming into play. And Albertans not wanting to pay the toll will start using our rural roads to go around the tolls, which will create more transportation, more demand on our roadways and our transportation corridors. And what the municipalities are clearly saying is that we won't have the money to keep those infrastructure requirements in place. We saw it even in the north when we started to see all of the runoff and the amount of water that was sitting on the fields that was washing out the roads. Again, it took weeks to get some of those bridges and those roads back into place. It cost the municipalities a substantial amount of money to be able to do that. And now they're being told, well, that's too bad, so sad, but we're not going to give you any more supports for that. So there's lots of concerns and lots of issues with this. And again, we haven't really heard this government come forward and come up with a solution around the taxes that are still being owed by oil and gas companies. And I mean, maybe one of the ministers would like to stand and speak to that and tell the municipalities why it is that they have to download all of the costs onto their citizens while they have oil and gas companies who still owe property taxes to the municipalities. That's a huge amount of money. You want to help municipalities out? Let's get a way to start getting those taxes paid. Let's find different ways where we can make sure that municipalities are vibrant and are sustainable. And there are things that are happening that the government could be addressing that doesn't cut funding, but in fact will support the municipalities in being able to access more. If we look at what's going on with the town of Cochrane right now, I feel our recreational infrastructure has fallen behind and is something we really need to focus on. It has become apparent that COVID just how important our recreation is not only for our physical health, but our emotional well-being, and how it brings the community together is something that is really important. So I'm really enjoying working with the committee and advancing the projects that are happening in Cochrane. And of course, again, as I have gone back and said numerous times through this speech, that speaks also to the programs that are offered through our ag societies. So I would hope that as we're looking through these different programs that are being cut, that the ministers that also have those portfolios that have the ability to maybe boost funding for different services that are being provided or different agencies that are being provided, will be doing that instead of cutting those services. Because again, if we start cutting ag societies and now we're cutting municipality budgets, and then the next thing is we're increasing property taxes, and parks. So Albertans, if they want to leave their house now, will have to pay to use every service in this province at a time when many of them aren't working. To say to someone, the healthiest thing you could do this summer is to go camping, because then you are within your cohort, you're outside, and the likelihood of being exposed to COVID is less. And then say, but you have to pay to use that service, and we're going to increase the cost of that for you. And yes, we know your property taxes are going up. Yes, we know your transit costs are probably going to go up. Yes, we know you might have to pay tolls, and your personal income tax has gone up. And what else could we charge you for? Let me think about it. I'm sure there's something else. Maybe land titles. If you want to go get a new house, you might have to pay more for land titles, because we'll probably privatize that. There's just all these things that this government wants to do, that wants to make sure that Albertans pay for it. Because there's no reason why, the taxes that Albertans are already paying should provide them with the needs that they deserve. Because apparently this government doesn't think that that's the way it should be. You pay your taxes, we'll keep that money, we'll spend it on things that make no sense, like war rooms and Bigfoot and all of these fights and legal challenges on a variety of different issues. But if you want to get on the bus, you have to pay more. Or if you want an LRT in your city, you can't have that because, we're not paying for that this time. Or, you know, if you want to go camping, or you want to go to a park, or you want to go swimming, you have to pay more to go swimming. And like, these are things that young families do. It's what keeps young families healthy. And so to see more pressure being put on Albertans at a time when they don't need it, when in fact they just need to feel supported.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29, 2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate on Amendment RA1 on Bill 56? Seeing the Honourable Member for Edmonton Meadows.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise in the House to speak to the Amendment RA1 to the Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021. So, Madam Speaker, so first of all, it was my pleasure, and I was the opportunity to hear the debate from my colleagues delivered their arguments so eloquently. Looking at this bill and some of the actions, the changes the bill is trying to do, it is very actually interesting and surprising for me that this bill is basically brought forward by the UCP government in this House. So the reason why this is so surprising to me is since the UCP government took office 2019, so I have been hearing very different terminology, different debate in this House, and that seems very contradictory in this bill. So it was totally different narrative when the UCP government took the office. We heard the words and terms more like autonomy, fair deals, and the responsibility of the governments. The province always, wanted to hold the federal government responsibility for helping the provinces. And all what I'm seeing in this bill is a totally contradictory move against what they have been trying to set up for debate in this province. And the other thing I do remember, my very first impression in this assembly, when we first got the chance and we got, to share our maiden speeches. The members of the assembly from both sides of the aisle so eloquently, so passionately spoke about their ridings, the area they're representing, the municipalities, the facilities, and the services in their area, and the challenges in their riding, in their municipalities. Specifically, I remember then most of the members talking about the aging infrastructure in their municipalities, impacting services, struggling governments. And that's what I hear. That would be on the record. We can see that. That's what I still remember in my mind. It was not only the NDP members, it was most of the members in this House. And what I'm seeing this, how this government could come up with this kind of thoughts and changes in mind in midst of the economic crisis we are going through, when the municipalities in today's democratic system is a setup, the fundamentally important to deliver the services to citizens and I'm just losing the word, citizens and their, the well-being of the citizens. So we have seen the government brought up changes in the past. The municipalities, spoke out against it. The government kind of did not buy the argument of the opposition party in the House. But then we had facts, we had outcomes. The municipalities were to look around and deal with the situation, and that was impacted by the growing cost of services for the citizens. That is something that included was one area of the cost to the citizens of the municipalities were in the way of increased taxes, property taxes. And that is, again, when I look back and remember the debate and the arguments from the conservative politicians, lower taxes. But in reality, what I'm seeing in this House, the pattern of work is everything is happening against and the contrary to the arguments and narratives and election campaigns that's being created in this province. So what government is doing? This government is finding every possible way through this bill that they can download the cost to the municipalities. So the other surprising thing that is the majority of the UCP members comes from the small municipalities, and those municipalities are steadfast against these kind of changes and what it will take for them to stand up, look into it, and be reasonable and represent their constituents. And that is not the approach we are seeing in this House. The municipalities are already running under constraint of lost revenues due to the slow economy, losing businesses, lost revenue due to business being closed, and the tax liability against the super rich corporations that the provincial government specifically mandated and let it happen, that the big players or bad players could just, go by not paying the taxes to the municipalities. The unpaid tax liabilities have reached to nearly $245 million. That is the cost to them. That's about more than 200% since the UCP took office in the province. And UCP has already made the changes to our 911 emergency service that they still could not come up with justifying their move or being able to answer the question raised by the municipal politicians, the head of municipalities, opposition, and from the general public, how that has increased the service or efficiency of 911 and the safety of the people in this province. On top of that, the UCP is adding another cost to the citizens for the 911 emergency update program. That cost is about $41 million for already struggling people. So one of the things I just wanted to mention and put it on the record probably, I had a friend of mine, actually they are joint venture providing transportation services. And I remember the city of Camrose actually trying to work out the agreement with that company to make a transport arrangement between the Edmonton and Camrose for consecutively for 2-3 years. And then the municipality was not able to afford the cost that would need to come up with in order to make that arrangement. So I wonder, this question probably won't be valid, like who do you consult and who provided you the feedback when we see Calgary, Edmonton, Lethbridge, Cochrane, or number of Canmore, number of other municipalities speaking against this bill. So why the government is so adamant to move this bill when it's not going to help anyway to any municipal governments and also not to the citizens of this province. So to me, if I just leave away my own views, the narrative this government have been setting up since 2019, according to that, this bill seems pretty undemocratic and just a unilateral, one-sided ideological approach, authoritarian approach. They are not even engaging the views from those very people and the local governments. They are party to this contract, and they're going to be affected by this bill. So that is the reason I support the amendment RA1. So this is very wise at this moment that this bill not be read second time in this House. As the state, I'm just going to read the amendment for the record. Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021, be not now read a second time because the Assembly is of the view that municipalities cannot sustain, keyword, the reduction in funding proposed by bill without making substantial cuts to services or substantial increases to property taxes. And that is what the Conservatives have always campaigned on. And now, the government can just clearly tell us, so how much dollars you are going to cut to the municipalities? Did you add it up? Did you already tally it? Thank you.
Member Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate on Amendment RA1 on Bill 56? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to rise and speak to debate on Bill 56, and the reasoned amendment on the bill, and I think this is my first opportunity to join the House for an evening session, so I do say a good evening to all. Now, my colleague, the member for Edmonton Manning, of course, brought forward this amendment, recognizing the undue burden this government is placing on municipalities with Bill 56. Now, this, of course, has been largely the experience of municipalities with this government. Even more so, I think, than perhaps any other previous Conservative government, and certainly there were some pretty fractious relationships at times between progressive Conservative governments and municipalities in the province of Alberta. And certainly the time that we were in government, we worked to smooth that out. We worked to support municipalities during what was a difficult economic period for them then as well. Of course, which culminated in the specific deals with Edmonton and Calgary, which this government, of course, chose to tear up despite the fact that it had campaigned on a promise that it would not do so. And the experience, I think, of many municipalities, certainly under the former Minister of Municipal Affairs, was a somewhat antagonistic one, and certainly a very paternalistic one, Madam Speaker, an awful lot of condescension. And that is indeed what we see continuing, perhaps with a bit of a nicer face on it and a bit of a politer tone, but certainly from this legislation, we continue to see that lack of respect from the provincial government for their municipal partners. And indeed, this government does not seem to see them, Madam Speaker, as partners. They see them as theirs to control. Now, recognizing municipalities, of course, are created by provincial legislation. But that said, they are an elected order of government. And indeed, we can see great leadership from these orders of government in the work they do for their communities. Now, one area of particular contention, which is tied into this, as the member for Lethbridge East spoke about, as well as my colleague from Edmonton Manning, is, of course, the area around 911 in ambulance dispatch. Now, certainly, again, in this bill, we have here the government making some sweeping cuts to municipalities. And again, utterly undermining their ability to continue to provide services and supports for their communities, much as we have had with the 911 service and ambulance dispatch. And to be clear, this is yet another place, Madam Speaker, where this government has been so incredibly condescending and paternalistic towards your municipalities. Now, at a joint press conference that was held by the four mayors who were affected on February 1st, they noted some of the profound issues they have encountered already. They talked about an incident on January 26th, just 13 hours after Calgary's system was consolidated by AHS. And they talked about how AHS failed to notify the paramedics of an outage at the Calgary Dispatch Center that lasted 72 minutes. Leading to a 16-minute response delay. 16 minutes, Madam Speaker. Now, AHS contests that it was actually only a 42-minute outage as opposed to a 72-minute outage, but they certainly have not contested the fact that it led to a 16-minute response delay. That could very well cost a life, Madam Speaker. AHS did not either provide any explanation for that disruption, as the letters wrote in a letter to the health minister. In Wood Buffalo, a caller requested an ambulance, was transferred 3 times, had to provide their address 6 times, resulting in a 4-minute delay. An incident in Lethbridge where a fire dispatch monitor caught a delay in ambulance dispatch for an individual who was suffering chest pains. They were fortunately able to send fire resources there with just a brief delay, but if he had not caught that disruption, it could have been a 30-plus minute wait, Madam Speaker. So these are municipalities who had their dispatch systems well in hand, local control. Indeed, the mayors offered to pay the difference in the cost, so it would not have even cost the province a single extra dollar to allow them to continue to maintain that local control. The government said, no, we know better. So that is why I support this reasoned amendment, which says this bill should not be read a second time because it is impossible for this bill to go forward and have municipalities be able to sustain the reduction in funding that this bill proposes without them making substantial cuts to services or substantial increases to their property taxes. Now again, as my colleagues have ably laid out, this is a government that loves to download costs on others. This is a government that loves to duck responsibility, loves to blame other people. Be it Ottawa, be it everyday Albertans for failing to follow the rules well enough, as the Premier did just recently in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nothing is this government's fault. But let me be clear, Madam Speaker, this government is making very short-sighted decisions when it comes to our municipalities. I'll outline one particular situation here in the City of Edmonton, which I've previously spoken about in this House. The City of Edmonton has asked this government for a mere $4.9 million to fund support services for hundreds of units of supportive housing. A simple ask in the last budget that would save millions more in the healthcare system, in the justice system, and in social supports. They have made that request multiple times to this government, and they have not listened. As a result, the City of Edmonton was turned down for federal funding that would fund hundreds more units because this government refuses to step up and make that investment. An investment, again, Madam Speaker, that would save money for the province, as well as for the City of Edmonton. Now, that is a local government that is showing leadership, Madam Speaker. Leadership well beyond this government in addressing the real issues, in solving the issue of houselessness in our city, Madam Speaker, as opposed to merely shuffling things around, pouring more money into the broken shelter system. And in this bill, we again see this government doing precisely the same thing. A government, Madam Speaker, that continually leaves money on the table. These federal dollars that could be going into construction, creating jobs here in the City of Edmonton, created much needed housing for individuals who are living houseless. But this government does not want to put any of its own money on the table, so those dollars get lost, much as we saw with their yet-to-be-announced Jobs Now program, which may be jobs eventually, jobs we sure hope so at some time in the future, but which we have yet to see an announcement on. We have no idea whether the tens of millions of dollars that they asked for in supplementary supply ever actually got out the door for that program. Because again, they failed to act and they dragged their feet and they left dollars on the table because of their inability to collaborate, their insistence that they must control everything, despite the fact that the loss then is felt by Albertans, because they insist on pursuing their own political ends before the good of the province. And that is precisely what we have happening here again in Bill 56, where this government is leveling sweeping cuts on municipalities on top of those that they had already piled on previously. Cuts to things like police funding, which the former Minister of Municipal Affairs and now Minister of Justice will of course swear up and down do not exist, but we know in fact they do. Because again, this is a government that likes to play games with words to try to hide what its actions actually are and what the impacts actually are on the people of Alberta. But the municipalities know the truth. They have spoken out quite clearly on this point. They have spoken out about what the real impact of this bill is. Barry Morishita, the president of the AUMA, he was quite clear that there is a lot of unintended consequences here, and that means a lot less people working in Alberta over the next 3 years. As my colleague from Edmonton Manning laid out quite clearly, this government likes to brag about what banks are saying now, but banks are talking about the fact that Alberta is going to perhaps begin to catch up with other provinces. We need to do better than that, Madam Speaker. And we could be if this government was choosing to make the investments that would put more Albertans back to work, that would allow the construction of this infrastructure that is going to prepare our province for the future, strengthen our communities. But as Mr. Morishita says, this government is not doing that, and as a result of the choices they are making in this bill, the sweeping cuts, they are indeed going to be a lot less people working in Alberta over the next 3 years. He says some projects are going to have to be laid aside, some infrastructure maintenance is going to go undone. Reeve Jason Snyder from Vulcan, he speaks to this government's propensity for, again, not wanting to pay its share, not wanting to collaborate, leaving opportunity on the table, because it has more important places for those dollars to go, Madam Speaker. Places like their $30 million embarrassment of a war room. After all, someone has to fight Bigfoot. That's more important than an investment in supportive housing or supporting the town of Vulcan, Madam Speaker. And Reeve Jason Snyder, he talks about the funds for their new pool. The county is willing to provide roughly about $1 million over 4 years towards recreation in Vulcan. He says that's a significant contribution for them. That comes after 6 attempts to get funding from the MSI. It was a difficult conversation for them, he says. He recognizes the financial reality of living at the moment. He says all municipalities are feeling the squeeze. We're cutting everything, says Mr. Snyder. So there's an opportunity again where this government could be supporting the town of Vulcan in providing and building for the future, enhancing their community, putting people to work in construction, but it's choosing to look the other way. It's choosing instead to level cuts. Fort Saskatchewan Mayor Gail Katcher. Now, of course, her local MLA was standing and praising this bill just a moment ago. But she notes that this 2021 provincial budget, and with the cuts in this, that leaves municipalities bracing for about a 25% cut in infrastructure spending. That means their next city council is going to have to make some serious decisions. She said, in fact, of the budget, I don't think there are any wins for municipalities. Now, they had the foresight to see these cuts coming. They've got the read of this government. And again, they'd seen the lack of collaboration under previous municipal affairs ministers, and they'd seen that this is not a government that is interested in investing in the province of Alberta. So they have made some adjustments in how they're approaching this. And again, speaks of how the city of Fort Saskatchewan has been working very diligently to keep our property taxes as low as we can while still providing high quality services for our residents. Indeed, they are doing their best to provide leadership, Madam Speaker. Because at least they remain accountable to the people. They are closest to the ground, as it were. And admittedly, I have to say they have been showing better leadership. I have not seen a collection, certainly not as many as 18 city councilors coming out and signing a letter undermining the public health officer, the chief medical officer of health, or the public health officials, or our public health measures that are in place to protect Albertans. Now, I'm aware that there certainly are some amongst them that hold those views, but they have not taken the extraordinary step that we have seen members of this government caucus do, in choosing to listen to particular members of their community, but certainly not many others who are looking for protection of public safety and health. So again, I support this amendment. This government is on so many fronts failing Albertans and undermining the ability for communities to get back on their feet.
Member Standing Order 29 2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate on Amendment RA1 of Bill 56? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That's exactly where I represent here in the province of Alberta, and very proud to do so. Of course, Edmonton Northwest is part of the municipality of Edmonton, which has been affected quite negatively by this legislation that's been brought forward by this UCP government. And so I think that the honourable member from Lethbridge West, who brought forward this reasoned amendment, is actually doing this UCP government a favour, because in fact this legislation has so many negative effects on the budgets of our municipalities around the province that the backlash and the effects of legislation like this will have very far-reaching effects on the infrastructure that we all rely on in our cities, both large and small, the essential services that municipalities are responsible for, and indeed the health and safety of Albertans, both who live in municipalities or use the services of our municipalities as part of their daily lives. Really, at this time, at this juncture, to go directly attacking a municipal agreement that has been very long-standing and has served quite well between the province of Alberta and our municipalities across the province is a very perilous course to take at any time. But right now, with the economic downturn and a serious health emergency right across the province, it is definitely not the right time to do so. And so we have built within the legislative process ways by which we can reasonably take a step back and reasonably amend legislation that perhaps doesn't fit the reality of what we're dealing with on the ground here in the province. Never seen a better time to put forward a reasonable amendment that will not just help to keep the lights on in our municipalities across the province, but quite frankly will help to send a more positive message from this UCP government to the province of Alberta that they're willing to take a step back from the quite radical agenda that they've brought forward to cut services and to cut municipal services and responsibilities, and to realize and recognize the circumstances that people are living in right now. I can't think of a better example of the myriad of ways by which this negatively affects municipalities than in regards to 911 and emergency medical services across the province. Not just a few days ago, when I was making some phone calls into different parts of Alberta, which is a very interesting process, let me tell you, because people are hopping mad. I had a very good conversation with an EMS person who works in a smaller town outside of Calgary and described in great detail of how that emergency medical service that she is a part of in this municipality has been already jeopardized by changes that this provincial government has made to EMS services. She said that wait times are longer, that she's getting stuck in Calgary for a much longer time once they do bring in emergency individuals to larger hospitals. And indeed, the system is stretched so that their response times are longer than they were before, longer than what could be considered reasonably safe for the administration of these essential services. So when we see examples of that coming from individuals, this individual explained it to me very clearly, that people's lives are put into danger by messing with the, as she said, messing with the emergency system that she's a part of. Madam Speaker, that's quite unconscionable, quite frankly, And then when I look at the extra costs that are being downloaded as a result of the change in the MSI from this legislation, again, having a premium, I was astounded to see, of a premium to put onto people's cell phones because to pay for this cut by this provincial UCP government. I know that different municipalities, you must be feeling the pressure on the other side because the city of Lethbridge made very explicit that they had wanted nothing to do with this change to the dispatch aspect of Alberta emergency services. They said that we run and we know our localities, we know the streets, we know the back streets and the alleys and how to get to the place at the very fastest time. And running a system like that out of Calgary for a city like Lethbridge literally puts people's lives in danger. And so I don't think that, Madam Speaker, there's any more explicit way to describe just how unreasonable this legislation is in its current form and on how it would be reasonably amended by moving forward and leaving it for either committee work or for reflection over the next 6 months to wait for things to cool off a bit and to have for more reasonable ideas to be put forward. We have so many testimonials from municipalities around the province describing in detail how this legislation and this last budget has compromised their ability to do infrastructure maintenance and renewal of essential services, of bridges and roads and so forth, how the cuts through the budget and through this change, through this legislation, have compelled municipalities to talk about continuing to municipal tax increases, having more user fees and so forth, and making life generally more expensive for Albertans right across this province. And so, Madam Speaker, I think that this reasoned amendment is the best way to go, and I would urge all of our colleagues and members across the on the other side to consider voting in favor of it. Thank you very much.
Sitting Order 29 is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join the debate on Amendment RA1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to rise again this evening to speak to Bill 56, the Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act. Of course, we have before us an amendment that would once again ensure that this legislation be not now read a second time because the Assembly is of the view that municipalities cannot sustain the reduction in funding proposed by the bill without making substantial cuts to services or substantial increases to property tax. And once again, I would thank the member from Lethbridge West for bringing this important amendment forward, and I've appreciated the comments of my colleagues so far this evening. It's always important to hear from all elected officials in this House, and so I appreciate that they've brought the concerns of their constituents and from constituents outside of their own boundaries forward, something that we expect of all members, of course. And so very thankful to hear how those conversations have went with those MLAs and their community stakeholders, and it's quite clear from what we're hearing here today that this piece of legislation should not proceed. Based on the comments that have been brought forward by a variety of stakeholders across the province. We've heard from the president of the AUMA, the president of the RMA. Once again, when we look at some of our big city mayors, the mayor of Calgary said when this legislation was rolled out and when we started to hear about the MSI cuts being proposed by this UCP government, the mayor went on to say on the one hand they want us to build stuff and create jobs, but on the other hand they want to take away the money we need to build stuff and create jobs. Quite a succinct statement, I would say. And once again, when we look at the situation that we're in, Madam Speaker, right now, more than ever, I would argue, we need these important investments in our communities. And we've heard from a variety of stakeholders and from members, again this evening, that have brought forward those concerns, and I'm very thankful that somebody in this House is willing to bring forward those concerns, because if we took the government at their word, everything is going to be perfect as this bill rolls out. Nothing to see here. Don't worry about the funding commitments that we're going back on since the election, since we were in opposition from 2015 to 2019. Everything's good to go and municipalities are happy with these changes or understanding. But the fact is, when we look at the statements that have been made from stakeholders across the province, nothing could be further from the truth, Madam Speaker. And I'm sure that you've heard from your own constituents that they are concerned with this legislation. When we look at the comments from the Mayor of Edmonton, Don Iveson, explained that he was deeply concerned with the cuts not only to the city funding in this budget, but also to partner post-secondary institutions. When we reflect on other changes that this government has made, it's really our post-secondary institutions are getting hit from either side, not only on the funding from the provincial side, but they're also being forced to raise tuition for students in our communities. And so at the same time as we have our provincial government explaining that there's not enough funding for important infrastructure, for important services in our community, at that same time they're also saying that we don't have that funding for our post-secondary institutions. And it really is going to have a cumulative effect on our communities. In the midst of a pandemic, we should be doing everything we can to support those post-secondary institutions to ensure that we aren't experiencing what many would call brain drain, but unfortunately this government seems to have very little concern for that fact. And once again, we're seeing facilities in our post-secondary institutions and faculties on the chopping block. We've seen many lose those positions already, and unfortunately that kind of institutional knowledge is not something that we can bring back as easily as we can cut it. Now, whoever the next government is going to have to deal with the consequences of the short-sightedness of this government. And I suppose you might just call it the nature of politics. But the fact is, it is going to cost us much more to ensure that we can contain that institutional knowledge, to contain concerns about brain drain, and this government, once again, has very little concern for that. But just once again, reflecting on what the Mayor of Edmonton spoke about or said in reference to MSI funding cuts, he went on to say it's very disheartening, and not just for Edmonton, but the future prospects of cities in this province of all sizes. It's layer after layer after layer, and it just really constrains what the city can do, even on basic maintenance, which is a job creator. So not only do we have municipalities saying that they can't fund important infrastructure projects, important projects that would sustain jobs in our province and build new infrastructure and new services, but we can't even maintain and sustain the maintenance, the basic maintenance in our municipalities. Now, I know that quite often we hear, whether we're municipally elected or provincially, often it comes to our office, the concern about neighborhood renewal and maintenance of roads and arterial roadways in our province or in our cities. And unfortunately, the mayors of our major cities and of our rural municipalities have laid it out quite clearly that with the funding that this government is providing, that basic maintenance is not going to be sustainable. It's incredibly unfortunate, Madam Speaker. when we look at the cuts that are being proposed and, we listen to the government talk about how this money is front-ended. And so if a municipality makes the decision to invest in infrastructure, which I hope they still are having those discussions, and I know they are, but they're also concerned about what happens the years following as we look at trying to sustain, maintain, and staff those new facilities that are hopefully being built across our province. They aren't going to have the funding for those new facilities because the fact is they don't have the funding today for the facilities that are already in our communities. And so, once again, very short-sighted decisions from this provincial government. They are continuing to spend money on frivolous things like energy war rooms. We've heard that several times this evening and over the last several months. An organization that has zero transparency in a ministry and a minister who isn't willing to bring the numbers to the table and ensure us and assure us that that money is being spent responsibly and to the best benefit of all Albertans. Now, there's another piece of this conversation, which I believe has been commented on to some extent this evening, about how cuts to MSI are going to also compile on cuts to CIP and CFEP to our municipalities. And we have heard from, whether it be community leagues, whether it be nonprofits, that the cut amounting to over 50% of a budget for organizations in our municipalities, whether it be, once again, community leagues, nonprofits like End Poverty Edmonton, organizations that are focused on building affordable housing or supportive living facilities, that money is also being cut. And what was the answer that we were provided by the minister in charge of that funding? There is a one-time payment rolling out to these organizations if they are lucky enough to get that funding in the first place. But, Madam Speaker, just like we saw in the childcare subsidies that were previously $25 a day, and of course our government had the plans to expand that across the province, of course, the UCP came in and completely axed that program. Hundreds of millions of dollars sat in that minister's budget, unspent, and their answer to the thousands of Albertans who came forward to say that the new plan, or lack of a plan, is not supporting Albertans, that minister's answer was to, just like we see in CIP and CFEP, to provide a one-time payment. But I would also commend the critic on this file for bringing forward the fact that these one-time payments would have been enough to sustain something like a $25 a day childcare program for several years moving forward, but instead, a very unscientific process of just handing a one-time payment back to these facilities and to these providers and to these families with children that are accessing these services, a one-time payment. A minuscule amount compared to what that minister should be investing in childcare in the middle of a pandemic, when we should be doing our best to heighten the level of standards across the province, but we've seen the exact opposite from this minister. And so whether it's on this file, on Bill 56 and MSI funding cuts, whether it's on childcare, whether it's on cuts to CIP and CFEP, this government continues to say one thing, but does the complete opposite. And it's hard because we see it day in and day out, and it becomes harder and harder for Albertans to listen to the direction and the messages coming from this government and take it at face value. And when a government loses the ability to keep the trust of Albertans, then we have a whole other issue on our hands. And it really seems to be the case. And the fact is, on many of these issues, even more recently, it seems like even the government members, the caucus members within the government, don't trust the direction of this premier. So how is the premier and the government supposed to go out and tell Albertans one thing and have them believe that when their own caucus doesn't believe it? There is a lot of work to do on this front, Madam Speaker, and For the benefit and the sake of my community, I hope that this government is up for the challenge, but at this point, it doesn't seem to be the case. We are seeing community groups such as community leagues, nonprofits who are providing subsidized or lower cost food options for people in our community. We're seeing these organizations falling apart. We are seeing them lose their funding. We are seeing them unable to further provide these services that they've provided for so many years, and it's disheartening, Madam Speaker, to see these organizations that have supported our communities for so long, and because of the direction of this government, simply have no future, have no hope on the horizon. And unfortunately, what that is going to mean when these organizations begin to disappear from our communities, that cost is going to go back to the provincial government. And so once again, when we talk about the short-sightedness and the decisions that this government are making to try and, I guess, what you might call balancing a budget, the fact is they really haven't had any movement on that compared to when we were in government. Yet what are we getting, Madam Speaker? Once again, $30 million on a war room. The energy cap removed as Albertans and my constituents are being hit with $500 utility bills. Now, they made the good decision, the right decision to temporarily freeze put in place deferrals, but all of these deferrals that Albertans have been hit by are now coming to an end, and this government has no direction for those Albertans who cannot afford to pay for their current utility bills, not to mention the deferred utility bills that were done so previously. And unfortunately, Madam Speaker, while Albertans struggle, while community leagues and community nonprofits and municipalities struggle, I really am not sure who is doing better. When I think of who is doing better because of the decisions of this government, I can only think of one group, Madam Speaker, and it's lobbyists. And so how have we gotten to a place as representatives of our community where we're only concerned about the vision and the comments of lobbyists? While our municipalities are struggling to pay for basic infrastructure and basic maintenance and are laying off thousands of frontline workers, I guess the lobbyists are doing all right. So maybe that is a win in this Premier's books, I'm not sure. But the point is, Madam Speaker, as we look at Bill 56 and the amendment before us, that this legislation should not now be read a second time, put forward by the member from Lethbridge West, I am fully in support of that. The fact is, we have laid out this evening and quite often before that people like the president of the AUMA, like the president of the RMA, like the mayors of Calgary and Edmonton and Cochrane Town councillors and the reeves of communities like Vulcan and Fort Saskatchewan, many of these people are the people that the government side, that the government caucus is supposed to represent. So what happened here? Where was the disconnect from when you were elected and you made these commitments like MSI funding, like ensuring indexing AISH and other important community supports, like supporting our communities through programs like CFEP and CIP? Where was the disconnect between when you were elected on those very important programs and those platforms and where we are today?
Members, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all members to direct their comments through the chair. We are now at Standing Order 29-2A. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly Clearview.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to rise and ask my friend and colleague, the member for Edmonton West Henday, to further expound on one of the topics he spoke about tonight. I appreciate his comments regarding the amendment to Bill 56, referring it to committee. One of the things I'd like to hear more from the member is around the surprise increase on cell phone bills for the 911 service. And hoping to hear from the member, recognizing that he represents a riding here in the city of Edmonton. However, all members of the chamber receive correspondence from Albertans throughout the province. On that note, Madam Speaker, I think it's important to remind Albertans that although we are elected within our own ridings, I believe that we represent all Albertans. And it's our job as elected representatives to listen to the voices of the people of the province. It's similar in municipal politics, where I appreciate city councilors have boundaries. But I would argue with any city councilor that says to an Edmontonian or a Calgarian, oh, don't talk to me, go talk to somebody else. Sorry, I don't represent you. Now, they may not vote for that individual councilor. However, two arguments can be made. One, voting boundaries are imaginary lines that actually shift, at least provincially, every 2 elections. I think it is incumbent upon elected representatives to hear the opinions of as provincially elected officials as those in the province of Alberta. And so I know I've heard of examples, believe me, I get emails from folks who have written my office to say, I've tried to write my own MLA, they refuse to answer my response, my email, or respond to my concerns. Will you? And the answer is yes. And so, I know that the member for Edmonton West Henday has heard from Albertans from all corners of the province regarding this UCP government's ideological drive to consolidate the 911 service, despite the fact that evidence has indicated that response times will be increased and costs are going up. And so I would love to hear the member for Edmonton West Henday to comment further on what he's heard from his constituents and other Albertans on this issue.
Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the comments and the question from the member. And the fact is, without getting into any details, when we look at this bill and the fact that this government is going to force municipalities to take on the burden of $41 million, that is, at the end of the day, a tax increase on Albertans. There's no other way to explain that or for that to play out, Madam Speaker. This government was elected on a campaign to not raise any taxes. But we've seen time and time again, and in this bill, that the government is doing the exact opposite. And when it comes to the consolidation of these services across our province, I think it speaks for itself that there are members of the government who quietly, very quietly, go back into their community and say, I don't support what our government's doing, but when it comes time to vote, either they will support this piece of legislation, like they have other pieces of legislation to consolidate these services, or they won't vote at all, potentially. And I would never venture to say who that might be, Madam Speaker, but the fact is the record will show who stood up for their communities when it came to the consolidation of these services, or speaking out against. So we've seen on a number of fronts, more recently, unfortunately, several members of the government speaking out against very real health measures that were put in place to support the health and well-being of Albertans. We saw the government caucus step out of line of what the Premier has been saying.
Honourable members, any members wishing to speak to Amendment RA1, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my privilege to rise tonight to speak to the amendment that would ask that we delete all words after that. I think when we're looking at this piece of legislation, what I'm hearing over and over is that there is a lot of elected officials from municipalities all across the province that are saying that this doesn't make sense. This is one more thing that this government is doing that is dismantling their ability to provide supports, resources, infrastructure to their communities. Who lives in those communities, Madam Speaker? Albertans. And I can tell you that I'm a born and raised Albertan. I lived in Spruce Grove, born at the Royal Alex, followed my dad. He was working for Calgary Power and TransAlta. We moved to Whitecourt, and that's where I spent most of my childhood. And I can tell you that as a child, growing up in small town Whitecourt at the time, we were actively involved as a family within the community. We went to the public swimming pool. I took tennis lessons at the tennis courts. We had birthday parties at the community center. We played in hockey tournaments all across northern Alberta, whether it was in Edson or Sangudo or Barhead. So many of my childhood memories are being actively involved in communities all across this beautiful province. Family weddings that took place in Onaway or Spruce Grove or Black Diamond. Baseball tournaments that was put on by the community. I remember being little and going to a red eye and just being so excited that my parents were playing a baseball game that lasted the whole weekend, and we got to stay up. And that was an event that was put on by the community. And it brought in so many other, it was in Bruderheim, and it brought in so many other communities to come together to celebrate. And I think some of the facilities that I attended as a child, whether it was a cousin's wedding or an aunt's baby shower, those facilities are in desperate need of upgrades. They are in desperate need of repairs. And to think that we have a government that is not supporting communities and gathering spaces that so many in this room have experienced. My kids played hockey, and so we've done hockey tournaments all over Alberta. We've always stopped faithfully in Nanton at the candy store and get ice cream. It's part of my childhood, and it's part of my children's childhood, traveling this beautiful province that we have. And the countless baby showers and weddings and family reunions that we've done in these small communities that need our help. They're asking. Community leaders are coming to this government and saying, please don't do this. The cuts that we've already been given are putting our communities at risk. The infrastructure that they have is crumbling. To think that some of these spaces that I grew up enjoying as a child, as a teenager, as an adult, might not be available. These communities might actually cease to exist, is devastating. We have such a beautiful province. We have so many people that want to come together. They want to create pride in their community. And the number one way to do that is to invest in your community. If you have facilities that are renovated, people are going to have weddings there. I might not live in Whitecourt anymore, but when I go for a school reunion, I won't say what year it would be, but I want to be able to do it in Whitecourt, in their community hall. I don't want to have to travel to a different town because Whitecourt didn't have the funding to support their community buildings. I want to be able to show my kids where I grew up and say, this is where I played. This is where I had a dance tournament. Those things that as you get older, you start telling those stories over and over and over to your kids. My kids are starting to do that. Oh, remember, Mom, when we went to Vulcan? Or remember when we went to Glendon and we looked at the giant pierogi? And we have photos of the Easter egg? Like, these are things that communities have done to stand out in Alberta, to create travel and tourism in the province. We did a summer where we did a road trip and we tried to hit as many of the world's largest that we could. They didn't believe me when I said that there was a UFO landing pad in Alberta. And that was the community of St. Paul that said this is something that we want to do to demonstrate to other Albertans or people driving through to come and visit our community. If those infrastructure pieces aren't invested in, They're going to lose that ability. When you go to St. Paul, they have a community that's built around the landing pad. They have a pizza place it's called UFO Pizza. And I have to say, it has the best donair pizza that I've ever had. And when you have communities that are so proud in whatever it is that they're known for, the whole community comes together to support that. And when we're putting funding at risk for some of these municipalities, there's a huge problem when this government isn't listening. These are human experiences. These are Albertans' livelihoods. These are their homes. These are the places that they return to show their kids. And we have community leaders all across the province saying, please, pay attention to us. Invest in us. We matter. We want to belong. We want to contribute. We want to be able to invest in our swimming pools, in our recreational facilities, in our walking paths, something that right now, in the middle of COVID, where people can't get together and they can't socialize, people are isolated. They're stuck at home. Why wouldn't you want to invest in nature trails around the community? There's some beautiful walking paths in Alberta. There's opportunities to go, and I remember going with my dad and him pointing out different flowers, different edible things. And it was safe to do that, and it's safe to do that in COVID. But if you're not investing in the communities and the municipalities, those experiences are at risk. And we've heard over and over different quotes from different municipal leaders, desperate for this piece of legislation to not go through. So when I see this amendment that says we just stop it not be read a second time, because the Assembly is of the view that municipalities cannot sustain the reduction in funding proposed by the bill without making substantial cuts to services or substantial increases to property taxes. That isn't the words of us. That is coming from leadership all around the province. Elected representatives from municipalities, from communities like Whitecourt, like Spruce Grove, like Turner Valley. All of those places that I grew up experiencing, that my kids have grown up experiencing, that every one of the members in this legislature represents. And I'm just confused how members opposite, Madam Speaker, can stand in the chamber and speak in support of this. I know that there's so many communities that are pleading with our side of the House to stop the changes because their members aren't listening. They're getting up and they're speaking their key messages. They're not representing the voice of those that we're hearing from. They're pleading to stop the cuts, to give them the ability to be able to invest in infrastructure, to be able to invest in roads. My family on my dad's side they were farmers from Sangudo, from Alberta Beach. They did ranching, bull farming, and a lot of them have heavy, heavy equipment that is required to use the roads. And if we're not investing in our secondary highways or our back roads, those farmers' livelihoods are at risk. If they can't transport their heavy machinery or their product, they're at risk. And we're hearing from them saying, you need to continue to invest. We need to continue to look at the infrastructure that we support as a municipality. And that means roads, not just buildings, but actual roads to be able to get their product in a timely manner where it needs to go. And so when we are asking for this amendment to be considered, I'm asking all members of this chamber to truly think about what their constituents are asking for and what they're telling them. Because what we're hearing on this side of the House that the member from Edmonton Beverly Clareview talked about is that the average person that's reaching out to us isn't necessarily from our own constituencies. I absolutely hear from constituents from Edmonton Castle Downs, but I also hear from constituents all across the province talking about their concern with the cuts. And right now, we're hearing, I know the government is hearing, from municipal leaders, mayors, reeves, city councillors, begging for this piece of legislation to not go through. They've already seen so many cuts. They're telling this government what is going to happen. They are at risk. They have so many municipalities in the rural communities that are struggling with millions of dollars of unpaid property taxes. They have infrastructure that's crumbling. They're talking about these unintended consequences. When you have a government that isn't supporting municipalities, that means they're not supporting the people in those communities. It's going to force the municipalities to increase service property taxes. It's going to force them to make substantial cuts to services that they rely on. If they're not going to listen to the opposition, which we've seen a trend in this legislature, we're asking that they listen to all of those municipal leaders that have been very clear that this bill is not supportive of municipalities. It downloads more cost onto them. It has taken away significant funding to their budgets, which forces them to make cuts to services that all Albertans rely on, and they don't want to do that. They're struggling. This is a time where the whole province, the whole country, is dealing with a global pandemic. And Albertans are not exempt from that struggle. People are being laid off. This is a government that promised more jobs. The municipalities are saying, we can create more jobs. We need money invested in infrastructure where we can pay our people to come and fix roads and to fix those community centers that are in desperate need of revitalization. You want the economy to be supportive of jobs, yet you're not giving the money to the municipalities where those jobs can be created. I believe that it was Mayor Nenshi that spoke about that, had said to the Calgary Herald, sorry, my glasses are fogging up from my mask. On the one hand, they want us to build stuff and create jobs, but on the other hand, they want to take away the money we need to build stuff and create jobs. Very simply put, Mr. Speaker, that this government, on one hand, is saying they want to create jobs. They're looking at the municipalities and the leadership in the communities to do those things. But then they're not actually providing the supports and resources that are required to do those things. They're taking that funding away. They're reducing the MSI, which is a complete contradiction to actually being able to create jobs. If you want to create jobs, the municipalities are saying, we want to help. We're here. We have projects that are ready to go. But when you cut our funding, we can't actually invest in that. So we have to take away more services that our constituents, our community rely on top of taking away potential good-paying jobs. It just doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker, when we're looking at all of these leaders that are coming forward expressing concern, and this government just isn't listening. So we're asking with this amendment that it not be read a second time. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. If anyone has a brief question or comment, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was struck by a couple of things that the Honourable Member from Edmonton Castle Downs brought forward with a very impassioned sort of survey of the importance of municipalities to building community. The first of which being Whitecourt, quite frankly. And, I think Whitecourt is a very good example of a town that was very much resource-based, but a conscious decision was made probably around the time when your family had moved there and just growing up, to try to not just have people going there and working in camps, but rather working and then building a community that's adjacent to the forest industry and the pulp and paper industry that kind of formed the nucleus of the town. And so, I haven't spent a lot of time there, but I certainly can see it as almost a similar development history to Hinton, Alberta, right? Where you had the pulp and paper industry built there. And then, so it wasn't just a place to perhaps have people working in work camps and working in the bush and whatnot, but you could have your family there. And the way that you could attract people to have your family there is to have that municipal infrastructure that would allow the kids to go to school and have an ice rink and have nice parks and all of the things that make quality of life improve to the point where people want to live in a place. And Madam Speaker, I think that we're at a juncture here now where we can look at that same model and make sure that we go back to that future, go back to that place where we are building community and building affordable communities for people to live in, right? Because we're seeing an interesting phenomenon, not Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I apologize. Where, even though we're in an economic downturn and there's COVID, that real estate prices are flying through the roof, right? Across the different parts of our province. And it's very hard for young families to get a foothold into a mortgage that would allow them to have a home and settle in like that, right? And so municipalities, especially in the sort of suburban communities around Edmonton and Calgary, for example, need an investment to build that affordable infrastructure for families to be able to carry on with their dreams and aspirations for creating families and community for the next generation. It's as simple as that. And you need to nurture that, which of course will give you an exponential growth and increase to your economy by putting in the seed money of building that infrastructure so that it's there for people to use and have an affordable community, right? You see it all over the province. Another town of, let's say, for example, Black Falls, right, just outside of Red Deer. It just grew up out of the prairie. Well, I guess it took a number of years, but a remarkable growth of a suburban community outside of Red Deer that was nurtured and was allowed to grow like that because there was a municipal investment in recreation facilities, right, in schools, and all of the sewers and roads and whatnot that you need for a modern suburban community to grow into. And so always you got to look 2 steps ahead, Mr. Speaker, when you are building for the future, and that's what our job is in this place, is to look not just now and say, oh, it's economic downturn, let's cut everything and, scorched earth, right? But play the next 5 or 10 years down the road and look for what you will do to attract and nurture that new economy to grow and to prosper. And the key, Mr. Speaker, is to make sure you are investing in young families, affordability, and the infrastructure that comes from municipal development right across this province, right? Not just in Edmonton and Calgary, but in a place like Black Falls or in Whitecourt, right? Or in Hinton, Alberta, right? All of these are towns and municipalities that have families, and we want young families to grow and to prosper into those places every step of the way. So again, a very reasonable amendment, I think, to pull back on a very unpopular and I think poorly conceived bill. And I encourage everyone to make that choice to support this reasoned amendment here this evening.
Honourable members, that concludes the time allotted for 29-2A. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to Amendment RA1? Honourable member for Edmonton, Beverly, Clairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm slightly surprised you had to look down to see my writing title. Fair enough. For those at home, the speaker, ever on his toes, was looking to see if I've spoken to RA1. But I have not. And so it's my pleasure to get up and rise and speak to this reasoned amendment, which, for those following at home, what this amendment would do is postpone the second reading of this bill to 6 months hence. No, it would not do that. What it would do is delete all the words after that, substitute the following, which would essentially amend this bill so that more work can be done on it. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, as I was listening to two of my colleagues, the member for Edmonton Castle Downs and the member from Edmonton Northwest, speaking to this bill, I do want to just offer my appreciation to the member for Edmonton Castle Downs, who always speaks to bills from a position of her values, from a position of her passion, and I personally love the fact that she draws on her personal experiences, which is often her children and her family, talking about the impacts of a bill and how she talked about the impacts to her community if the Assembly passes this bill. I also want to give a shout out to the member from Edmonton Northwest for his comments on highlighting the argument around quality of life. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, his comments triggered a thought that I haven't spoken about yet, which, when we talk about municipal investments, which, for those just tuning in at home, the current bill we're debating puts into legislation a significant cut to funding to municipalities that deliver core services around the province. But what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is once again, this government talks about attracting investment, but their actions do the opposite. Their actions and their financial allocations or cuts are actually a hindrance to attracting investment. You see, Mr. Speaker, the government loves to talk about companies like mCloud and Infosys and how they've decided to invest in Alberta, which is a significant win for Alberta. And we thank them for their investment, and we applaud them. In fact, I'd actually like to give credit on Infosys to Calgary Economic Development, who, in our term in government, worked with them to initiate conversations with Infosys. And their diligence and focus and relationship building with the company has led to Infosys's investment in Calgary. I always find it interesting when the current government of Alberta tries to take credit for Infosys's investment when they had little to nothing to do with it. But I applaud Calgary Economic Development, who were the champions, who started this. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the big attractions or draws for companies, global companies, but also local companies, to stay in the province of Alberta is because of our quality of life. And the member for Edmonton Northwest triggered this thought in his comments, and so I appreciate that. That companies like Infosys have stated that the top reasons for choosing Alberta to invest are quality of life and access to talent. What drives me crazy is that this government, time after time, attacks these very reasons that these companies are coming to Alberta. They undermine them. Infosys talks about the quality of life as one of their top reasons for coming to Alberta. Which order of government delivers at the grassroots quality of life more than any other government? Municipalities, because they provide the core services that Albertans rely on in a day-to-day basis. I'm not saying municipalities are more important than the provincial government or more important than the federal government. They're all important. But Albertans touch, feel, experience the services delivered by municipalities more than any other order of government. And I'm happy to get into a debate with folks on that. That's my experience. That's also the experience of every single councillor, mayor, or reeve I've ever spoken with. So you have an example of a company like Infosys coming to Alberta based on quality of life, and here in this bill, the government is gutting municipalities who help deliver on quality of life. What boggles my mind, Mr. Speaker, is that the government of Alberta, this UCP government, talks about attracting investment in one breath, and in the other breath, knocks the legs out from the very agencies or organizations or orders of government that are helping to deliver on that. Their second reason, Infosys, for coming to Alberta is access to talent. This is weeks before the government releases its budget, which guts post-secondaries. Like, I really wished the folks on the other side of the house would put these together. You're cutting municipalities who provide core services that impact quality of life. You're making cuts to our education system. And I'm sorry, maintaining funding is a cut. You know that. And if you don't know that, then you need to do your homework, because there's something called inflation, which increases the costs on everyone year to year. In addition, in our education system, you have 30,000 new students joining our schools every fall. So when you don't increase funding, it's a cut. You don't believe me? Don't believe me. Go ask a teacher. And in fact, the reality, I am a teacher, but I'm saying ask a teacher who's currently in the system. The reality that are facing our teachers is abhorrent. It's beyond upsetting. But in this bill, talking about municipalities, if you don't see the connection between cuts to municipalities, cuts to post-secondaries, cuts to education, attacking doctors, and picking fights with our healthcare system, then you don't get it. You know, I appreciate this government is applauding and lauding technology companies and investment that has come to Alberta. I encourage the government to look at the fact that, yes, this year there has been, in 2020, a substantive increase in venture capital investments. That's not because of you. Those investments are the critical work that organizations like the Alberta Enterprise Corporation have done, but it takes years to attract and build those funds. And I'm not attributing it to our government. I'm saying these take years. So the frustration is you applaud these companies that are investing in Alberta, but they're not doing it because of you. They're doing it despite you. You're putting up obstacles and challenges in front of these companies, and they're finding innovative ways to work around the government of Alberta. The fact that we still have a growing interactive video game industry, I applaud all of the entrepreneurs for doing it because they are working uphill. Other provinces across the country have incredible incentives to attract these companies. And the problem is we are losing talent to these other provinces. You know, I also find it completely hypocritical that some tax credits are okay, according to the government, and others are framed as picking winners and losers. You can't have it both ways, even though you've tried to do that. I also love the fact that many of the members on that side of the House voted against incentives for the petrochemical industry, time and time again. And now suddenly, because the investments are in the billions, the government's like, "Ooh, this is a great idea." In this bill, and the reason I'm supporting this amendment is because the proposed cuts to municipalities are bad for a host of reasons. But in this speech of mine, I've been focusing on the impact to industry, the impact to attracting investment, the impact to incenting and keeping Alberta companies here in the province. And when you take away funding to municipalities, the very entity and order of government that's responsible for our roads, for our local on-the-ground logistics, which impact every single business, you're in fact hurting our ability to attract investment and retain and grow companies here in the province. And this bill, should it pass in this legislature, Mr. Speaker, will hurt Alberta's ability to attract investment and retain and grow our very companies, because they rely on municipal infrastructure, no matter where they are in the province. You know, Mr. Speaker, if the government of Alberta was coming to the legislature with a proposal to replace MSI, then I think the opposition would look at that with an open mind and weigh the pros and cons of the new program. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is once again, this government is making ideological decisions, cutting MSI before they actually have a program in place to represent it. Does this sound familiar? Let's see. The Alberta Investor Tax Credit, the Interactive Digital Media Tax Credit, a number of programs that were working to support Alberta businesses, attract investment, and increase employment in the province. But the government made an ideological decision to gut it, and then there was a vacuum of 18 months before any program was put forward at a fraction of the amount under the NDP government. Mr. Speaker, I cannot support this bill because the government has not put forward any reasons for these massive cuts other than hurting Alberta entrepreneurs and jobs and attracting investment in this province.
Standing Order 29-2A. Seeing none, are there others wishing to speak to the amendment? Seeing none, on the amendment to Bill 56 RA1. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. In my opinion, the noes have it. That amendment is defeated. We are at second reading of Bill 56. Is there anyone wishing to speak to second reading? The honourable member for Calgary-McCall has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise to speak to the second reading of Bill 56, Local Measures Statute Amendment Act. I think we heard from colleagues about this bill, that how this bill will impact municipalities, and it's simply implementing hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts to municipalities. And these cuts will add up, and cumulative impact of these cuts will be that people will pay more in property taxes. People will see cuts in their services, and it will threaten the viability of the municipalities. And this bill also forces municipalities to pay another $41 million in 911 upgrades with no support from the province. So these costs, timing of these costs couldn't be worse, and I think municipalities don't support it, and we're not able to support it. And with that, I move that we adjourn debate on this bill.
Honourable members, having heard the motion as proposed by the honourable member for Calgary-McCall to adjourn debate, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 55, College of Alberta School Superintendents Act, debate adjourned.
Honourable members, before the Assembly is second reading of Bill 55. Are there anyone wishing to join? The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise again this evening, and this time to speak to Bill 55, the College of Alberta School Superintendents Act. Now, in general, this bill does not seem to be controversial. Fairly straightforward. The creation of a new regulatory college within the province of Alberta for school superintendents. Professional college, so to include our educational superintendents, our deputy superintendents, whether they're in the public, separate, or francophone school authorities. As with most colleges, they would be responsible then for professional development, setting learning requirements for its members. Fairly straightforward, allows them to police themselves. They would have some opportunities to, I guess, have a disciplinary committee to look over if there was any accusations of serious misconduct. Of course, they would be within the control of the minister then to determine what precisely would be done with that individual. The committee would make recommendations regarding suspension or having a professional certificate revoked. This would also remove the power that the minister currently has, or responsibility, however you want to view it, of approving the superintendent contracts with school boards. So my understanding is this is the request that had been put forward by superintendents, that they had made this request to the minister. They had asked of this government to create this college. And it's interesting to me, the issues in education on which this government chooses to listen to the people of Alberta. So certainly I can respect that they felt it was worthwhile to listen to superintendents, but I would note this government has not seen fit to listen to many Alberta teachers, principals, other educational staff who have called for much more support for our schools in the midst of this global pandemic. It's interesting to me what this government chooses to prioritize in terms of bringing forward bills to do with education and indeed supports. What it chooses to act on. What it chooses to prioritize at a time when we have such incredible disruption in our education system. Thanks in large part to decisions this government itself has made, such as choosing to lay off over 20,000 educational staff via social media at the beginning of the pandemic last year, March of last year, just over a year ago. Now, you'd think their priority, Mr. Speaker, would be to be getting some of those folks back in the classroom at a time when teachers could use that support more than ever. Perhaps that would be a way to help reduce class sizes, to help provide a safer work environment, particularly as we see the spread of these far more virulent variants of concern. But instead, what we have in front of us today is Bill 55, creating a new regulatory college, which in itself, as I said, is not necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly is an odd priority at a time when at a single school in Athabasca-Barrhead, we have, to my understanding, 100 students who have been impacted by COVID-19. Now, interestingly, the MLA for Athabasca-Barrhead has nonetheless feels that we should be lifting public health restrictions at this time, despite the fact that he has this happening in his backyard, impacting so many students and individuals, and his area being one of the top areas in the province per capita for new COVID cases. But his government instead brings forward Bill 55 to create a new College of Alberta Superintendents, school superintendents. Now, we haven't heard, at least to the best of my knowledge, specifically from many school superintendents, about the new curriculum, which is another odd priority that this government is pushing through at a time when they're causing other disruption. Now, of course, their priority here seems to be creating a new College of Alberta School Superintendents. They are listening to them, but of course they are not listening to the over 90% of teachers who have expressed that they have no faith in this government's curriculum, or the now going on 13 school boards who have said they will not pilot it because it is so incredibly flawed, age inappropriate, ideological. But this government's priority is not to listen to them. It is to override them. It is to claim that they have widespread support that is not being lambasted across the province, as I believe the Premier said, even though folks see it occurring every day. But instead of the government addressing that issue, we are here tonight debating Bill 55, the creation of a College of School Superintendents. And indeed, one might say this is about as relevant to Albertans right now as, the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne, to students in grade 2. But of course, that is what the government considers to be a priority right now for moving forward. One might say this is about as relevant as the social studies curriculum, really, that they're looking to force through, and as which is incredibly age inappropriate, and this seems to be an inappropriate focus, I would say, at a time when schools are already struggling with having to deal with not only the global pandemic and not only the over 20,000 educational staff with this government laid off, the majority of whom never found themselves back in a classroom due to, of course, this government's educational cuts. which they will deny, but we know exist, and every school board in the province will tell you exist, and every teacher who is dealing with the implications of that in their classroom will tell you exists. But this government's priority is to introduce Bill 55 and create a College of Alberta School Superintendents. Which tends to be what we see from this government. They're not paying attention to everyday Albertans. They're not paying attention to the actual implications and effects of their cuts. They are not paying attention to the actual damage this is doing to so many. They are not paying attention to the hundreds of Alberta families who are forced into isolation because their child has been involved in a situation where they were exposed to COVID-19 in their school. Even as the new, far more virulent variants of concern are spreading rapidly, having now become the dominant strain in the province because, again, this government chose to sit on its hands and instead prioritize things like bringing forward Bill 55, the College of Alberta School Superintendents Act. There are so many things this government could be doing right now to make a better school system, Mr. Speaker, to be supporting students and parents, to be supporting teachers, as opposed to laughing at them, as we saw the Premier and others do earlier today. Deriding their elected representatives who speak on their behalf.
Order is called. The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika.
Mr. Speaker, we are getting later in the evening, and I would like to get this continued debate in what I think would be a friendly and orderly manner, but to suggest that the Premier, which the member from Edmonton City Centre just noted, was laughing at teachers today, would be a mischaracterization. Had he suggested that the government caucus or members of the government would be laughing at teachers, might not, maybe a little more parliamentary, I guess, based on precedents that I've noticed ruling on points of order, but to suggest the Premier was laughing at teachers would be impugning false motives, and it would be an incorrect assertion in this chamber. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask that you ask that member to apologize and maybe clarify what he meant to say, if it was indeed something else.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe it's not a point of order. Member was simply referring to an exchange during the question period today, where the leader of the official opposition referred to teacher views about the curriculum and referred to Jason Schilling, the head of the teacher union, and how 91% of the teachers have rejected this curriculum. And I was present here, and Premier did, in fact, along with other members of the caucus, laughed. And that's exactly what my colleague from Edmonton Centre is referring to. It's not a point of order. It's something that happened right here in this legislature.
Agree, it is not a point of order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I can appreciate that the Deputy Government House Leader is perhaps a bit sensitive on the topic. Deputy Government House Whip, I apologize. But I recognize that government members are a bit sensitive on the topic. They have been ignoring their constituents on this point for some time, instead prioritizing things like the College of Alberta School Superintendents Act, Bill 55, which I'm sure not a single one, I'm fair to say, of their constituents has written in with this concern. So I would suggest then that perhaps they would consider that rather than spending the time of this House on this bill, which again is itself innocuous and I suppose will be fine. I don't see any reason I would oppose it. But I can tell you certainly from my inbox that there are far more Albertans that are concerned about the many ways in which this government is utterly failing our education system, utterly undermining teachers in classrooms, both through this global pandemic and the lack of supports and the failures on that front, but certainly even more so for the damage that may be done in the future should they proceed with their badly flawed curriculum. But That is not the priority the government brings forward. Instead, they prioritize things like Bill 55, the College of Alberta School Superintendents Act, and choose to stand in this place and indeed deny the reality of how Albertans are universally responding to their decisions about our education system. However, as I said, in general, this bill does not fail in the way that so many of this other government's actions on education do. So I suppose, in general, this bill will probably meet with my support. But I look forward certainly to hearing more from this government about how it intends to repair the serious damage it has done and is planning to do to our education system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, are there others wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise this evening once again and speak to Bill 55, College of Alberta School Superintendents Act. And while it's my first opportunity to speak on this piece of legislation this evening, I have indeed spoken to some extent on it in previous days, but I appreciate the opportunity to rise again, and I appreciate the comments from the previous member, the member from Edmonton City Centre, and laid out quite clearly many of my thoughts, most definitely. But just quickly, while we take a look through this legislation, once more, a bit of background, just the idea with this legislation, creating a professional college for educational superintendents and deputy superintendents employed in public, separate, or francophone school system. Of course, it will lead to, if passed, the opportunity for superintendents and the college to regulate and govern itself accordingly, which we see in many other regulated professions. And so it seems to be, for the most part, pretty straightforward, Mr. Speaker. But I have to echo many of the comments of the previous member that while we are here debating this legislation, which may or may not have been requested by consultations or excuse me, by the group of members affected by this legislation through consultation, I can appreciate that and appreciate that we need to move forward on this. But I also hope that we can all appreciate the fact that there is many other, as the previous member stated, important topics and opportunities for us to have conversations about the many shortcomings and failures of this government to take action on the very important file that is education in our province. And I think back to, I believe, late July of last year when our caucus brought forward recommendations, an alternative plan for the school reentry plan. Of course, this government at the time, relatively early into the pandemic, showed very little understanding for the circumstances and very little understanding for the impacts that their unwillingness to move on this important file was going to have on our communities. And we've seen this situation play out now. The previous member spoke to some extent on that, about certain schools across our province having hundreds of students being affected by COVID-19, and even more families. And that is in certain constituencies alone, and across the province it's thousands upon thousands. And instead of taking swift action, this government, despite the calls of teachers, families, educators, support staff, pretty much everyone other than the government who was calling for support from the UCP, against all of those recommendations, simply, Mr. Speaker, did nothing. Now, at that time, we had put forward our alternative plan for school reentry, and I will, to some extent, speak to that. Number one being to set a province-wide cap on students per classroom of 15 students per classroom and hire the necessary staff to accomplish that. Unfortunately, while this initiative was supported by, once again, many families and educators across the province and school boards, I might venture to say, we heard crickets from the government, and we saw no action on the opportunity to cap classrooms at 15 or any reasonable number. We saw no movement on that. Number two, Mr. Speaker, hire additional staff to cover paid sick leave and time off to care for sick dependents. Once again, no action from this government. Number three, Mr. Speaker, hire additional staff to meet parallel and fluctuating home learning demands. No doubt, many students and families were tasked with deciding whether their children would stay home, whether they would go back into the classroom with an expectation that educational opportunities would not change, and with that expectation, there was a need for additional funding. Unfortunately, that did not come, Mr. Speaker. Number four, hire additional custodial staff to ensure schools are cleaned thoroughly and constantly. Mr. Speaker, this list is 15 in total, and these are 4 now, and unfortunately, we saw zero movement on any of these initiatives. What did we hear from the minister when we put these forward, and when educators and school boards across the province asked for additional funding? The government came back with the talking point that we are reaching historical levels of funding for education. Neglecting to point out the fact that there was no new funding for the 20 to 30,000 new students each year that were entering classrooms in the K-12 system. Neglecting to point out the fact that there was really zero new supports going to be in place for these students who were entering a classroom in a whole new world. Number 5, Mr. Speaker, was to reverse the cuts to student support and rehire the more than 20,000 educational support staff that were laid off at the outset of this pandemic. So not only did this government not add any new funding for the education system, but they actually had the audacity to lay off 20,000 support staff. And this is at the same time that they were clawing back funding for, once again, additional supports for children with educational needs, for extra educational needs, with learning disabilities who so often get left behind. But thankfully, we have systems in place, systems that we need to strengthen. But instead of strengthening those systems, Mr. Speaker, we saw the exact opposite, that in addition to the cuts that had already been put in place under previous budgets, that they actually went further in the midst of a pandemic and cut 20,000 additional support staff. It's hard to understand how we got here, Mr. Speaker. It's hard to understand how you could be the Minister of Education and go in front of students and families and educators day in and day out and say that you are doing the best that you can. If this is the best that you can do, I would hate to see the worst, Mr. Speaker. The fact is, Albertans were expecting more from this government. They were expecting to see some reprieve from the ideological direction that this government has gone down. But unfortunately, we've only seen more of the same. And that's with additional opportunities for funding from the federal government even. Very little of that money has reached classrooms, has reached, across the board, has reached child care facilities. When we look at the opportunities for the critical worker benefit, we saw this government last minute at the 11th hour come forward to this legislature and say that we must pass this legislation because they waited until they had about a week, 2 weeks left to decide how that money is spent, and that we must pass that legislation as soon as possible. But across the board, what we've seen from this government is a failure to act. And unfortunately, when you're a provincial government and you fail to act, it, in this instance, is costing the well-being of families. And I might venture to say, in some instances, it might be costing lives, Mr. Speaker. We need to ensure that additional funding is in the classrooms. We made this clear in July of 2020. We made it clear at the onset of the pandemic that more must be done. But this government sat on its hands. And what we have now is, once again, hundreds of students in one school who have been affected by COVID-19, and thousands across the province. And I find it hard to understand how any member of this legislature, especially on the government side, could go back to their constituents and say that they've done enough. And the same goes for the draft curriculum that we have before us. Tens of thousands of Albertans have signed petitions across the province stating that this is the wrong direction, that this will not adequately support Albertans. And unfortunately, once again, the government is not willing to listen to the loud voices of Albertans. And so while I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, that we have Bill 55, College of Alberta School Superintendents Act, before us, and the importance that these colleges play in their role of regulating and administering these services, the fact is there is, I would say, very important pieces of legislation that we should be discussing, or opportunities to bring forward extra supports in our classrooms that really should be what we're discussing this evening. And so it's extremely unfortunate that we are here. Mr. Speaker, I've heard from so many Albertans who are doing their best to if they made the decision to keep their children in a classroom, are doing their best to work with educators and school staff to provide their children and those students with the best education possible. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, when a child has potentially come into contact with COVID-19 and returns to school after that mandatory quarantine, and a week later is back in a 14-day quarantine, what are we supposed to tell those families? What are we supposed to tell those students? Because of the inaction of this government to do anything as the 5 points I listed, I would say, number one, a province-wide cap at 15 students per classroom. I think that would have had a measurable impact on the lives and the education of students in our province, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that when we brought this forward, if I remember correctly, it was essentially disregarded completely. There was no willingness from this government to even have that discussion, that it was unreasonable to expect extra funding be provided to our classrooms, that it was unreasonable to expect classrooms to be capped at 15 or any of the points that we made in that 15-point proposal. You know, we went on point 7, talking about developing best practice guidelines to limit student travel between classrooms. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, when these 15 points came out, the minister said it essentially wasn't the government's responsibility to take care of these important initiatives, that it was up to the school boards to make these decisions. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that there's no opportunity to make decisions when your hands are tied to provincial funding and the provincial government is not willing to give you an extra dollar for the thousands, tens of thousands of new students that are entering the classroom. And I think that Albertans will look back on this and look back on the unwillingness to see any movement on the curriculum, the draft curriculum that this government has put forward. I think that it is going to be a defining moment in this government's short history in the province of Alberta. And I think that all UCP MLAs and MLAs on both sides should go back to their constituents and really listen to those concerns, because if you don't, I think that it will speak loudly in a couple short years. And so, once again, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to rise to Bill 55 a second time, I believe, the College of Alberta School Superintendents Act, and I thank everyone for that opportunity, and with that, I'll be seated. Thank you.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate this evening? Seeing none, I am prepared to call the question. Honourable members, the Minister of Education has moved second reading of Bill 55, College of Alberta School Superintendents Act. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for second reading? If so, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
55, College of Alberta School Superintendents Act is now read a second time. Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 58, Freedom to Care Act. Adjourned debate, the Honourable Mrs. Ahir.
The Deputy Government House Leader?
I move that we adjourn the Assembly until 1:30 p.m. on Tuesday, April 13th, 2021.
As proposed by the Deputy Government House Leader to adjourn until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. The House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30